Beneath the crowded barracks and endless barbed wire of Auschwitz there were places many prisoners feared even more than the camp itself. Hidden below the ground were underground cells where light barely entered, air slowly disappeared, and prisoners vanished into darkness for days, sometimes forever. These cells were not built simply to imprison people. They were designed to break them mentally and physically in total isolation from the rest of the camp. Some prisoners were starved there. Some suffocated there. Others waited in complete silence, never knowing if the next footsteps outside the door meant torture, execution, or one more day trapped underground. The Nazis wanted these hidden cells to become places without witnesses, places where suffering could disappear unseen beneath Auschwitz itself. But decades later, the stories still survived. Survivors carried the memories of those underground chambers beyond the camp fences, exposing what the regime tried desperately to hide beneath layers of concrete, darkness, and fear. Tonight, we descend into one of the most terrifying parts of Auschwitz. The underground cells where prisoners were hidden below the camp, cut off from light, hope, and sometimes even air itself. And what happened inside those walls reveals just how far the machinery of terror was willing to go to crush the human spirit completely. And before we begin, take a moment to like this video, subscribe to In&Out Nazi Germany, and let me know in the comments where in the world you're watching from. Every story, every memory, and every place matters. And together we keep history alive. Now let's begin. Chapter 1. Segment 1. The underground cells hidden below Auschwitz. As one begins descending deeper into the hidden world beneath Auschwitz it becomes increasingly clear that some of the most terrifying places inside the camp were not the crowded barracks, guard towers, or barbed wire fences visible above ground, but the underground prison. Cells concealed beneath the brick buildings of Block 11 where prisoners vanished into darkness, almost completely cut off from the outside world. Above ground, Auschwitz already existed as a system of starvation, forced labor, executions, humiliation, and constant fear. Yet beneath the floors of Block 11 lay another layer of terror, hidden from most prisoners and almost entirely invisible to the outside world. The underground cells represented a place where punishment became isolation, where silence became psychological torture, and where human beings disappeared beneath the camp into spaces designed specifically to crush the body and spirit. Together, as one reflects on the purpose of these underground chambers, it becomes evident that the Nazi administration created them not simply to imprison prisoners temporarily, but to erase hope itself through darkness, confinement, and fear hidden beneath the ordinary operations of the camp above. Prisoners throughout Auschwitz whispered about Block 11 with fear long before they ever saw its underground corridors directly. Known among inmates as the Death Block, the building already carried terrifying reputation because executions, torture, interrogations, and brutal punishments occurred constantly within its walls. Yet the basement beneath Block 11 inspired especially deep terror because prisoners sent there often disappeared entirely from normal camp life. Some returned physically destroyed after days underground. Others never returned at all. As one considers the atmosphere surrounding the building, it becomes clear that Block 11 functioned almost like a prison hidden within a larger prison, a place separated even from the brutality already surrounding Auschwitz itself. The underground cells inside the basement varied in design, but many were intentionally constructed to maximize suffering rather than simple confinement. Some were starvation cells where prisoners received no food or water for extended periods while locked inside total darkness. Others were standing cells so small that Multiple prisoners could barely remain upright together for entire nights without space to sit or lie down. Certain chambers lacked proper ventilation almost entirely, forcing prisoners to struggle for air while trapped beneath heavy doors and thick walls. As one reflects on the deliberate construction of these cells, it becomes evident that the underground prison system represented carefully organized torture integrated directly into camp administration itself. The journey into the underground basement often began with terror long before prisoners entered the cells themselves. Inmates accused of resistance, escape attempts, rule violations, sabotage, or political activity might suddenly be dragged toward Block 11 by guards while other prisoners watched silently from barracks or work details. Some prisoners later described hearing footsteps echoing through the basement corridors beneath the building while screams, silence, or gunshots emerged from underground chambers hidden below. As one considers what prisoners must have felt approaching those basement stairs, it becomes clear that the underground cells symbolize disappearance itself. Because once prisoners descended below the camp, they entered spaces almost entirely removed from ordinary human visibility. The darkness inside many underground cells became one of the most psychologically devastating aspects of imprisonment there. Prisoners trapped inside often lost all sense of time because little or no natural light entered the chambers beneath Block 11. Hours blended into days while silence, fear, hunger, thirst, and isolation overwhelmed the senses completely. Some survivors later described hearing only distant footsteps above them or muffled noises from neighboring cells while remaining unable to see anything inside the darkness surrounding them. As one reflects on these conditions, it becomes evident that the underground cells attacked the mind as much as the body because total isolation gradually weakened prisoners psychologically in ways difficult even for survivors to describe fully afterward. Certain underground cells became especially infamous throughout Auschwitz because they functioned essentially as instruments of execution hidden beneath the camp. Starvation cells condemned prisoners slowly through hunger and dehydration while other chambers suffocated inmates through lack of oxygen and overcrowding. The basement also contained spaces where prisoners awaited execution by shooting or other forms of punishment carried out beyond view of the main camp population. As one considers the purpose of these underground chambers, it becomes clear that the Nazi administration deliberately used hidden confinement not only to punish individuals, but also to create fear throughout the prisoner population above ground. The emotional atmosphere inside the underground basement remained overwhelming because prisoners trapped there existed almost completely separated from ordinary human contact. Guards controlled access to food, water, air, light, and movement entirely while prisoners below often had no knowledge of whether they would survive another day or ever leave the basement alive. Some inmates later described hearing distant sounds from above ground, footsteps, doors closing, voices, or work details moving outside, while remaining trapped beneath the camp unable to see daylight. As one reflects on these experiences, it becomes evident that the underground cells represented total domination through isolation and uncertainty. Yet, even within the darkness beneath Block 11, moments of human resistance and solidarity sometimes survived. Certain prisoners attempted quietly communicating through walls, whispering prayers, or sharing tiny amounts of water or comfort whenever possible despite brutal conditions. Some survivors later described hearing other prisoners tapping messages between cells or offering brief words of encouragement in the darkness. As one considers these moments, it becomes clear that even inside spaces designed specifically to destroy hope, prisoners still searched for ways to preserve fragments of humanity. Beneath the terror surrounding them, the underground basement also carried symbolic importance. Within Auschwitz, because it revealed how deeply punishment and secrecy operated inside the camp system, the Nazis did not rely solely upon visible violence above ground. They also created hidden spaces beneath the camp where suffering unfolded largely unseen by the outside world. Prisoners vanished below the surface into darkness while the ordinary routines of forced labor and camp administration continued above them. As one reflects on this hidden structure, it becomes evident that Auschwitz functioned through layers of terror extending even underground beneath the visible camp itself. Many prisoners feared Block 11 more than ordinary barracks because the basement represented uncertainty beyond even normal camp brutality. Prisoner could disappear below for days, weeks, or permanently without others knowing exactly what had happened. Rumors spread constantly about starvation cells, suffocation punishments, executions, and torture occurring beneath the building. As one considers how these fears circulated throughout Auschwitz, it becomes clear that the underground cells served psychological purposes extending far beyond the individuals imprisoned there because fear itself became another weapon, controlling prisoners throughout the camp. Ultimately, the underground cells hidden below Auschwitz reveal one of the most terrifying dimensions of the camp system. Beneath the visible structures of imprisonment and forced labor, the Nazis created hidden chambers designed to isolate, punish, suffocate, starve, and psychologically destroy prisoners away from ordinary sight. Block 11's basement became a place where darkness itself turned into a weapon while prisoners disappeared beneath the camp into silence and fear. Yet, despite the secrecy surrounding those underground cells, survivors later carried the memory of what happened below ground beyond Auschwitz itself, ensuring the terror hidden beneath the camp would not remain buried forever. As one descends deeper into understanding the hidden terror beneath Auschwitz, it becomes increasingly clear that some of the camp's most horrifying spaces existed below ground inside the basement of Block 11, where prisoners vanished into underground cells almost completely isolated from light, air, time, and the outside world. Above ground, Auschwitz already functioned through starvation, forced labor, executions, disease, violence, and psychological terror visible throughout the barracks and camp yards. Yet beneath the brick walls of Block 11 existed another level of punishment concealed from ordinary view, underground chambers where prisoners were hidden below the camp itself, inside spaces designed specifically to break the human body and spirit through darkness, confinement, fear, and isolation. As one reflects on the existence of these basement cells, it becomes evident that the Nazi administration intended them not simply as prison rooms, but as hidden instruments of suffering operating beneath the larger machinery of Auschwitz. Prisoners throughout the camp feared Block 11 deeply long before ever seeing the underground basement directly. Known widely among inmates as the Death Block, the building already carried terrifying reputation because interrogations, torture, executions, punishments, and shootings occurred regularly inside its walls. Yet the basement beneath Block 11 inspired particular fear because prisoners taken below often disappeared entirely from ordinary camp life. Some later returned physically destroyed after days underground, while others never emerged alive again. As one considers the psychological atmosphere surrounding the building, it becomes clear that Block 11 functioned almost like a hidden prison buried inside the larger camp system itself. a place where terror became concentrated beneath the surface of Auschwitz. The underground cells inside the basement varied in form, but many were deliberately engineered to maximize suffering rather than merely imprison inmates temporarily. Some chambers functioned as starvation cells where prisoners received no food or water while trapped inside complete darkness for extended periods. Others became standing cells so cramped that several prisoners had to remain upright together all night without enough space to sit or lie down. Certain underground chambers lacked proper ventilation almost entirely, forcing inmates to struggle for breath inside suffocating darkness beneath heavy doors and thick brick walls. As one reflects on the design of these cells, it becomes evident that the underground prison system represented carefully organized torture built directly into the structure of Auschwitz itself. The journey into the basement often began long before prisoners physically entered the underground cells. Prisoners accused of resistance, escape attempts, sabotage, political activity, or violations of camp rules might suddenly be dragged toward Block 11 under armed guard while other inmates watched silently from barracks or labor details. Some survivors later described hearing footsteps echoing through underground corridors beneath the building while screams, gunshots, or silence emerged from the basement hidden below ground. As one considers what prisoners must have felt while descending those stairs, it becomes clear that the underground cells symbolized disappearance itself because inmates entering the basement crossed into spaces separated almost entirely from ordinary human visibility. Darkness became one of the most psychologically devastating aspects of imprisonment below Block 11. Many prisoners trapped underground lost all sense of time because little or no natural light entered the basement chambers. Days blended together while hunger, thirst, silence, fear, and isolation overwhelmed the senses gradually. Some survivors later described hearing only distant footsteps above them or muffled sounds from neighboring cells while remaining unable to see anything within the darkness surrounding them. As one reflects on these conditions, it becomes evident that the underground cells attacked the mind as much as the body because prolonged isolation slowly destroyed prisoners psychologically in ways many survivors struggled to explain fully even decades later. Certain basement cells became especially infamous because they operated essentially as hidden execution chambers beneath the camp. Starvation cells condemned prisoners slowly through dehydration and hunger, while overcrowded standing cells punished inmates through exhaustion and suffocation. Other underground chambers held prisoners awaiting execution by shooting or further punishment beyond sight of the larger camp population. As one considers the purpose of these spaces, it becomes clear that the Nazi administration used hidden confinement not only to punish individuals but also to spread fear throughout Auschwitz itself because rumors of what happened underground terrified prisoners above ground continuously. The emotional atmosphere inside the basement remained overwhelming because prisoners trapped below existed almost entirely cut off from ordinary human contact. Guards controlled access to water, food, air, light, and movement completely, while prisoners underground often had no idea whether they would survive another night or ever leave the basement alive. Some inmates later described hearing distant noises from above ground, doors slamming, work details moving, guards shouting, while remaining trapped beneath the camp unable to see daylight. As one reflects on these experiences, it becomes evident that the underground cells represented total domination through uncertainty, silence, and isolation. Yet, even inside spaces designed specifically to destroy hope, moments of resistance and humanity sometimes survived. Certain prisoners attempted quietly, communicating through walls, whispering prayers, sharing encouragement, or tapping messages between neighboring cells whenever possible despite brutal conditions. Some survivors later described hearing faint voices or comforting words in the darkness beneath Block 11 that reminded them they had not been forgotten completely. As one considers these moments, it becomes clear that even underground beneath Auschwitz, prisoners still searched desperately for ways to preserve fragments of humanity against the machinery surrounding them. The basement beneath Block 11 also carried symbolic importance because it revealed how deeply secrecy and hidden punishment operated inside Auschwitz. The Nazis did not rely only upon visible violence. Within the camp yards or labor systems, they also created concealed spaces underground where suffering unfolded largely unseen beneath ordinary camp operations continuing above. Prisoners disappeared below the surface into darkness while forced labor details marched normally outside the building. As one reflects on this hidden structure, it becomes evident that Auschwitz functioned through layers of terror extending physically and psychologically beneath the visible camp itself. Many prisoners feared Block 11 more than ordinary camp life because the underground basement represented uncertainty beyond even the brutality already surrounding Auschwitz. A prisoner taken below might disappear for days, weeks, or forever without others learning exactly what happened underground. Rumors spread constantly regarding starvation, punishments, suffocation cells, executions, and torture hidden beneath the building. As one considers how these fears circulated throughout the camp, it becomes clear that the underground cells served psychological purposes extending far beyond the prisoners imprisoned there because fear itself became another weapon controlling inmates across Auschwitz. Ultimately, the underground cells hidden below Auschwitz reveal one of the most terrifying dimensions of the camp system. Beneath the visible structures of imprisonment and forced labor the Nazis created underground chambers designed to isolate, starve, suffocate, punish, and psychologically destroy prisoners away from ordinary sight. The basement of Block 11 became a place where darkness itself became a weapon while prisoners vanished beneath the camp into silence and fear. Yet, despite the secrecy surrounding those underground chambers, survivors later carried memory of what happened below ground beyond Auschwitz itself, ensuring the terror hidden beneath the camp would never remain buried completely. Chapter 1. Segment 2. Starvation cells and suffocation chambers. As one continues descending deeper into the hidden basement beneath Auschwitz, it becomes increasingly clear that some of the underground cells inside Block 11 were designed not simply for imprisonment, but for prolonged physical and psychological destruction through starvation, suffocation, darkness, and isolation because the Nazi administration transformed the basement itself into a hidden machinery of punishment operating beneath the visible structures of the camp. Above, prisoners throughout Auschwitz feared these underground chambers intensely because rumors spread constantly about inmates locked below without food, water, light, or air while guards controlled every aspect of survival. Some prisoners vanished into the basement for days before emerging barely able to stand. Others disappeared underground permanently. As one reflects on the atmosphere surrounding these cells, it becomes evident that the basement represented a place where suffering became carefully controlled through deprivation itself. Deprivation of movement, nourishment, oxygen, human contact, and hope. Among the most feared chambers beneath Block 11 were the starvation cells. These underground rooms functioned as instruments of slow execution where prisoners could be locked inside complete darkness, without food or water for extended periods while guards waited for weakness, dehydration, and physical collapse to destroy the body gradually. Unlike public executions or shootings carried out openly before other prisoners, starvation punishment unfolded hidden beneath the camp beyond ordinary sight. Prisoners trapped inside these cells often had no idea how long they would remain there or whether anyone above ground even knew they were still alive. As one considers the psychological horror surrounding starvation imprisonment, it becomes clear that the punishment attacked the mind as much as the body because prisoners endured not only hunger and thirst, but also uncertainty, silence, and isolation deep beneath Auschwitz itself. Survivors who later described the starvation cells often spoke about the darkness first. Little or no natural light entered the underground chambers, while thick walls and heavy doors cut prisoners almost entirely away from the outside world. Days and nights blurred together until many inmates lost all sense of time. Hunger intensified gradually while thirst became almost unbearable after only short periods. Underground. Some prisoners later described hearing distant footsteps above them or faint sounds from neighboring cells while remaining unable to see anything within the darkness surrounding them. As one reflects on these experiences, it becomes evident that the starvation cells were designed specifically to reduce prisoners into physical and psychological collapse through total deprivation. The basement also contained standing cells, among the most physically brutal punishment chambers inside Auschwitz. These tiny underground compartments forced multiple prisoners into spaces so cramped they could barely remain upright together. Prisoners trapped inside often had no room to sit, lie down, or stretch their bodies for entire nights while receiving minimal air through tiny openings in the doors or walls. Guards frequently packed several inmates together into spaces designed almost impossibly small for human confinement. As one considers the construction of these chambers, it becomes clear that the standing cells transformed exhaustion itself into punishment because prisoners remained trapped standing in darkness hour after hour beneath the camp. The suffocation chambers became especially terrifying because air itself became controlled by the administration. Certain underground cells lacked proper ventilation almost entirely, while overcrowding intensified the struggle for oxygen inside the sealed spaces. Prisoners later described heat, panic, exhaustion, and desperate attempts to breathe within the darkness as multiple inmates struggled together inside tiny underground compartments. Some survivors remembered hearing gasping, coughing, or weakened voices from neighboring cells, while others described losing consciousness from exhaustion and lack of air. As one reflects on these conditions, it becomes evident that suffocation punishment transformed breathing itself into a struggle for survival beneath Block 11. The journey into these underground punishment cells often carried enormous psychological terror even before imprisonment began. Prisoners accused of resistance, escape attempts, sabotage, or rule violations could suddenly be dragged toward the basement while other inmates watched silently from the camp above. Rumors about starvation punishments and suffocation chambers circulated constantly throughout Auschwitz, ensuring that many prisoners already feared the basement deeply long before ever entering it themselves. As one considers the emotional atmosphere surrounding Block 11, it becomes clear that the underground cells functioned not only as punishment for individuals but also as psychological weapons spreading fear throughout the camp population above ground. Guards Inside, the basement controlled nearly every aspect of prisoner survival. Access to food, water, movement, air, and even human contact depended entirely upon the decisions of the camp. Administration. Prisoners underground often remained completely dependent upon guards for any possibility of survival while simultaneously isolated from ordinary camp life and outside. Witnesses. Some inmates later described moments when cell doors opened briefly, allowing tiny amounts of light or air into the darkness before immediately closing again. Others remembered the sound of boots approaching in the corridor, triggering fear because prisoners never knew whether guards brought punishment, removal, execution, or nothing at all. As one reflects on these experiences, it becomes evident that the underground cells represented total domination through deprivation and uncertainty. Yet, even inside starvation and suffocation chambers, moments of human resistance and solidarity sometimes survived. Certain prisoners attempted quietly sharing encouragement, prayers, whispered words, or small gestures of comfort whenever possible despite brutal conditions. Survivors later described hearing neighboring prisoners tapping messages through walls or speaking softly inside the darkness to remind one another they were not completely alone underground. As one considers these moments, it becomes clear that even inside spaces designed specifically to destroy the human spirit, prisoners still searched desperately for ways to preserve fragments of humanity and connection beneath the terror surrounding them. The underground punishment system beneath Block 11 also revealed how deeply secrecy operated inside Auschwitz. Public violence above ground already terrorized prisoners daily, yet the basement added another hidden layer of punishment concealed beneath ordinary camp operations. Prisoners marched to labor details above while starvation and suffocation unfolded silently below the building. The separation itself carried enormous symbolic power because suffering underground became invisible to much of the camp population while still spreading fear through rumors and uncertainty. As one reflects on this hidden structure, it becomes evident that Auschwitz functioned through visible terror and concealed terror simultaneously. Certain underground punishments also carried symbolic meaning for the Nazi administration because starvation and suffocation represented methods of destroying prisoners slowly rather than through immediate execution. These punishments forced inmates into prolonged physical collapse while stripping away control over even the most basic human needs. Hunger, thirst, exhaustion, darkness, and lack of air gradually consumed prisoners beneath the camp while guards observed their suffering from positions of total authority. As one considers the deliberate nature of these punishments, it becomes clear that the underground cells were designed not merely to imprison bodies, but to dominate human existence itself through deprivation. Ultimately, the starvation cells and suffocation chambers hidden beneath Auschwitz reveal one of the darkest dimensions of the camp system. Beneath the visible machinery of forced labor, executions, and imprisonment. Above ground, the Nazis created underground spaces where prisoners endured slow destruction. Through hunger, thirst, exhaustion, darkness, and lack of air, Block 11's basement became a hidden world where survival itself depended entirely upon the decisions of guards while prisoners disappeared beneath the camp into isolation and fear. Yet, despite the secrecy surrounding those underground chambers, survivors later carried memory of what happened below ground beyond Auschwitz, ensuring the suffering hidden beneath the camp would not remain buried forever. As one continues descending deeper beneath Auschwitz, it becomes increasingly clear that the Underground punishment cells hidden inside the basement of Block 11 were designed not simply to confine prisoners, but to destroy them slowly through starvation, suffocation, darkness, exhaustion, and isolation, because the Nazi administration transformed the underground chambers into instruments of calculated physical and psychological torture hidden beneath the ordinary operations of the camp above. Prisoners throughout Auschwitz feared these basement cells intensely because stories circulated constantly about inmates trapped underground without food, water, movement, light, or even enough air to breathe properly, while guards controlled every aspect of survival completely. Some prisoners emerged from the basement physically shattered after days underground, while others disappeared permanently into the hidden chambers beneath the camp. As one reflects on the atmosphere surrounding these cells, it becomes evident that the underground punishment system functioned through deprivation itself, deprivation of nourishment, oxygen, comfort, time, human contact, and hope. Among the most feared underground chambers were the starvation cells hidden within the basement beneath Block 11. These dark rooms served as spaces where prisoners could be locked inside complete isolation, without food or water for extended periods, while guards waited for hunger, dehydration, weakness, and physical collapse gradually to destroy the body. Unlike executions carried out publicly within the camp, starvation punishment unfolded almost invisibly beneath the building. Away from ordinary prisoner life, prisoners trapped underground often had no understanding of how long they would remain there or whether they would ever leave the cells alive again. As one considers the emotional horror surrounding starvation imprisonment, it becomes clear that the punishment attacked both mind and body simultaneously, because prisoners endured not only physical suffering, but also terrifying uncertainty hidden beneath Auschwitz itself. Survivors later, describing the starvation cells, frequently spoke first about the darkness underground. Little or no natural light entered many basement chambers, while thick walls and heavy doors separated prisoners almost entirely from the outside world. Hours blended into days until inmates lost all sense of time, while hunger intensified relentlessly and thirst became almost unbearable. Some survivors remembered hearing faint footsteps above them or distant noises from neighboring cells, while remaining unable to see anything within the darkness surrounding them. Others described the silence itself becoming psychologically overwhelming, because prisoners trapped underground existed almost entirely alone with fear, weakness, and uncertainty. As one reflects on these experiences, it becomes evident that the starvation cells were constructed specifically to reduce prisoners gradually into physical and mental collapse through total deprivation. The standing cells beneath Block 11 became another terrifying form of underground punishment. These tiny compartments forced several prisoners into spaces so cramped they could barely remain upright together while trapped inside complete darkness. Inmates often had no room to sit, stretch, or lie down for entire nights, while receiving only minimal ventilation through small openings in the cell doors. Guards deliberately overcrowded the compartments, transforming exhaustion and physical pain into punishment themselves. As one considers the construction of these underground standing cells, it becomes clear that the chambers weaponized confinement itself, because prisoners endured hour after hour standing beneath the camp, unable even to rest their bodies properly. Suffocation punishment inside certain underground chambers created especially horrifying conditions because air itself became controlled by the administration. Some basement cells lacked adequate ventilation almost entirely, while overcrowding intensified panic and struggle for oxygen inside sealed spaces underground. Survivors later described heat, exhaustion, dizziness, coughing, and desperate attempts to breathe while packed together inside the tiny compartments. Certain prisoners remembered hearing weakened voices or gasping from neighboring cells, while others lost consciousness from exhaustion and lack of air. As one reflects on these experiences, it becomes evident that the underground basement transformed breathing itself into a struggle for survival, while prisoners remained hidden below the camp in darkness and fear. The descent into these punishment cells often carried enormous psychological terror before imprisonment even began. Prisoners accused of sabotage, resistance, escape attempts, or camp violations could suddenly be dragged toward Block 11 while other inmates watched silently from barracks or work details. Rumors concerning starvation punishments and suffocation cells spread constantly throughout Auschwitz, ensuring many prisoners feared the basement deeply long before entering it themselves. As one considers the emotional atmosphere surrounding Block 11, it becomes clear that the underground cells functioned not only as punishment for individuals, but also as psychological weapons terrifying the wider prisoner population above ground. Guards inside the basement controlled nearly every condition of survival underground. Access to food, water, movement, air, and light depended entirely upon decisions made by the camp administration, while prisoners trapped below remained almost completely isolated from ordinary human contact. Some inmates later described moments when doors opened briefly, allowing small amounts of light or fresh air into the darkness before closing immediately again. Others remembered the sound of boots approaching in the corridor, triggering intense fear because prisoners never knew whether guards brought execution, punishment, transfer, or continued imprisonment. As one reflects on these conditions, it becomes evident that the underground punishment system represented total domination through deprivation and uncertainty. Yet even inside starvation and suffocation chambers, fragments of resistance and humanity sometimes survived. Certain prisoners attempted quietly comforting one another through whispered prayers, tapping messages between walls, or speaking softly within the darkness whenever possible. Some survivors later described hearing neighboring prisoners offering encouragement or sharing tiny moments of human connection despite brutal conditions underground. As one considers these moments, it becomes clear that even inside spaces specifically designed to crush hope completely, prisoners still searched desperately for ways to preserve humanity beneath the terror surrounding them. The basement punishment system beneath Block 11 also exposed how deeply secrecy operated inside Auschwitz. Public violence above ground already controlled prisoners daily, yet the underground chambers added another hidden layer of suffering concealed beneath ordinary camp life. While labor details marched outside and guards patrolled the camp above, starvation and suffocation unfolded silently below ground. This separation itself carried symbolic power, because suffering underground remained largely invisible while fear surrounding the basement spread continuously through rumor and uncertainty. As one reflects on this hidden structure, it becomes evident that Auschwitz operated through visible terror and concealed terror. Simultaneously, certain underground punishments also carried symbolic meaning because starvation and suffocation destroyed prisoners slowly rather than through immediate execution. These punishments stripped inmates gradually of strength, movement, control, and dignity, while guards observed their suffering from positions of absolute authority. Hunger, thirst, darkness, exhaustion, and lack of air slowly consumed prisoners beneath the camp, while isolation weakened the mind together with the body. As one considers the deliberate nature of these punishments, it becomes clear that the underground cells were designed not merely to imprison people but to dominate human existence itself through deprivation. Ultimately, the starvation cells and suffocation chambers hidden beneath Auschwitz reveal one of the darkest dimensions of the camp system. Beneath the visible machinery of forced labor, violence, and imprisonment. Above ground, the Nazis created underground spaces where prisoners endured slow destruction. Through hunger, thirst, exhaustion, darkness, and lack of oxygen, the basement beneath Block 11 became a hidden world where survival depended entirely upon the decisions of guards while prisoners disappeared below the camp into silence and fear. Yet, despite the secrecy surrounding those underground chambers, survivors later carried memory of what happened beneath Auschwitz beyond the camp itself, ensuring the suffering hidden underground would never remain buried forever. Chapter 1. Segment 3. Prisoners who disappeared into the basement. As one continues descending deeper into the hidden terror beneath Auschwitz, it becomes increasingly clear that one of the most terrifying realities surrounding the underground basement of Block 11 was the uncertainty surrounding prisoners who vanished below because inmates throughout Auschwitz often watched fellow prisoners taken toward the underground cells without knowing whether they would ever return again. The disappearance itself became part of the punishment. A prisoner could be marched away suddenly under armed guard while others remained standing silently in barracks, work details, or camp yards, unable to ask questions or intervene. Sometimes the prisoner returned days later physically destroyed, barely recognizable. After starvation, suffocation, torture, or isolation underground. Other times the prisoner never emerged again. As one reflects on this atmosphere of fear surrounding Block 11, it becomes evident that the basement functioned not only as a place of hidden punishment, but also as a psychological weapon spreading terror throughout Auschwitz because the uncertainty surrounding who disappeared below and what happened there haunted prisoners constantly. The process often began without warning. A prisoner accused of resistance, sabotage, escape attempts, political activity, rule violations, or even minor infractions might suddenly hear their number called by guards or camp officials. Sometimes prisoners were seized during labor details or removed directly from barracks at night while exhausted inmates watched silently from bunks. Others disappeared after interrogations or accusations made inside the camp administration. As one considers the emotional impact of these moments, it becomes clear that the fear surrounding disappearance into the basement extended far beyond the individual prisoner because every inmate understood that nearly anyone could be taken below under the right circumstances. Prisoners later described the terrifying silence that often followed when someone disappeared into Block 11. Questions spread quietly through barracks and work units. Had the prisoner been sent to starvation cells? Were they being interrogated underground? Had they already been executed below the building? Yet open discussion itself remained dangerous because fear controlled communication throughout Auschwitz. As one reflects on this atmosphere, it becomes evident that uncertainty itself became another instrument of punishment because prisoners above ground lived constantly with the knowledge that unseen suffering unfolded beneath the camp beyond ordinary visibility. Certain prisoners vanished into the basement for punishments lasting days or weeks, while others disappeared permanently without explanation. Survivors later described seeing inmates return from underground confinement physically shattered, unable to walk properly, barely able to speak, severely weakened from starvation, dehydration, suffocation, exhaustion, or psychological trauma. Some prisoners emerged with faces hollow from hunger while others appeared emotionally distant after prolonged isolation inside darkness below the camp. As one considers what these returning prisoners represented to others in Auschwitz, it becomes clear that they became living warnings demonstrating the hidden terror operating beneath Block 11. Yet, many prisoners never returned at all. The underground basement contained starvation cells, suffocation chambers, standing cells, execution spaces, and punishment rooms where inmates could disappear completely from ordinary camp life. Fellow prisoners often never learned exactly what happened to those taken below because records remained limited. Executions occurred secretly, and fear silenced open discussion. As one reflects on these disappearances, it becomes evident that the basement functioned almost like a void within Auschwitz itself, a hidden space where prisoners vanished into darkness beyond ordinary human visibility. The emotional effect of these disappearances spread throughout the camp population constantly. Prisoners marching to labor details above ground past Block 11 while knowing suffering unfolded below their feet. Rumors circulated about starvation punishments, suffocation chambers, shootings, and torture, hidden inside the basement while prisoners wondered who might disappear next. Some inmates later described avoiding eye contact with guards near Block 11 because fear itself became overwhelming whenever prisoners approached the building. As one considers the psychological impact of this fear, it becomes clear that the underground basement controlled prisoners far beyond those physically imprisoned there because uncertainty and terror spread through Auschwitz continuously. Certain disappearances became especially haunting because prisoners sometimes heard traces of life still coming from underground after inmates vanished below. Survivors later described faint voices, coughing, footsteps, or sounds from basement corridors, while prisoners above ground remained powerless to help those trapped underground. Others remembered hearing silence suddenly replace earlier noises from particular cells, leaving inmates uncertain whether prisoners below had died or simply lost strength to make sound anymore. As one reflects on these memories, it becomes evident that the underground basement represented a hidden world of suffering operating directly beneath ordinary camp routines while remaining largely inaccessible to those above. Guards and camp officials used these disappearances strategically because uncertainty created fear more powerful than many visible punishments. Public executions already terrorized prisoners openly, yet the basement introduced another form of psychological domination built around invisibility itself. A prisoner taken underground might return destroyed physically and emotionally, or might disappear permanently without explanation. Fellow inmates therefore lived with constant awareness that hidden punishment existed beneath the camp beyond what they could fully see or understand. As one considers this system, it becomes clear that secrecy itself became part of the machinery of terror inside Auschwitz. Families and identities also disappeared inside the basement system. Many prisoners taken below had already lost names, belongings, and connections to ordinary life through deportation and imprisonment. Once underground, some vanished completely without surviving records or witnesses capable of explaining exactly what happened to them. Fellow prisoners sometimes remembered only fragments, a face, a number, a whispered conversation before disappearance, or the memory of someone being marched toward Block 11 one final time. As one reflects on these absences, it becomes evident that the basement represented another stage in the broader process of erasure operating throughout Auschwitz. Yet, even within this atmosphere of disappearance and fear, fragments of memory survived. Certain prisoners later testified about those taken underground, while survivors carried recollections of vanished inmates beyond liberation. Administrative records, survivor accounts, and preserved testimony sometimes restored traces of prisoners who disappeared beneath Block 11. As one considers the significance of these surviving memories, it becomes clear that complete erasure ultimately failed because witnesses preserved fragments of truth despite the secrecy surrounding the underground cells. The basement beneath Block 11 also revealed how deeply hidden suffering operated within Auschwitz itself. Public brutality above ground already controlled prisoners daily, yet beneath the camp another layer of punishment unfolded almost invisibly through starvation, isolation, suffocation, and disappearance. Prisoners vanished below while ordinary camp routines continued above them. This separation carried enormous symbolic power because the underground basement represented a hidden world operating beneath visible imprisonment itself. As one reflects on this structure, it becomes evident that Auschwitz functioned through both visible terror and concealed terror simultaneously. Ultimately, the prisoners who disappeared into the basement reveal one of the most psychologically devastating aspects of the underground cells hidden beneath Auschwitz. Prisoners vanished below the camp into darkness, starvation, suffocation, isolation, and uncertainty, while fellow inmates above ground remained haunted by fear and unanswered questions. The basement of Block 11 became a place where disappearance itself turned into punishment because prisoners could enter the underground corridors and never emerge again. Yet, despite the secrecy surrounding those vanishings, survivors later carried memory of the disappeared beyond Auschwitz, ensuring the hidden suffering beneath the camp would not remain buried forever. As one continues descending deeper beneath Auschwitz, it becomes increasingly clear that one of the most terrifying realities surrounding the underground basement of Block 11 involved the prisoners who simply disappeared below because inmates throughout Auschwitz frequently watched fellow prisoners taken toward the underground cells without knowing whether they would ever return again. The disappearance itself became part of the punishment. Prisoner could suddenly be removed from labor details, barracks, interrogations, or roll calls under armed guard, while others watched silently, unable to intervene or even ask questions safely. Sometimes, the prisoner later emerged from the basement physically broken after starvation, suffocation, darkness, exhaustion, or torture underground. Other times they vanished permanently without explanation. As one reflects on the fear surrounding these disappearances, it becomes evident that the basement beneath Block 11 functioned not only as a hidden prison, but also as a psychological weapon spreading terror throughout Auschwitz because uncertainty itself became part of the machinery controlling prisoners above ground. The process often began abruptly and without warning. Prisoners accused of resistance activities, escape attempts, sabotage, political involvement, rule violations, or even relatively minor infractions could suddenly hear their number called by guards or camp officials. Some inmates were dragged away directly from work details, while others disappeared from overcrowded barracks during the night while exhausted. Prisoners watched silently from bunks. Certain prisoners vanished following interrogations or accusations inside the camp administration. As one considers the emotional atmosphere surrounding these moments, it becomes clear that fear extended far beyond the individuals taken underground because every prisoner understood that almost anyone inside Auschwitz could disappear below the camp under the right circumstances. Prisoners later described the haunting silence that frequently followed when someone vanished into Block 11. Questions spread quietly through barracks, labor details, and camp corridors. Had the prisoner been locked inside starvation cells? Were they being tortured underground? Had they already died beneath the building? Yet speaking openly about disappearances remained dangerous because fear and surveillance controlled communication throughout the camp. As one reflects on this atmosphere, it becomes evident that uncertainty itself became another form of punishment because prisoners lived constantly with the knowledge that hidden suffering unfolded beneath Auschwitz beyond ordinary visibility. Certain prisoners disappeared underground for punishments lasting days or weeks, while others vanished permanently without surviving explanation. Survivors later described seeing inmates emerge from basement confinement physically destroyed, unable to stand properly, barely able to speak, weakened severely from dehydration, hunger, exhaustion, suffocation, or psychological collapse. Some prisoners returned with hollow faces and trembling bodies, while others seemed emotionally distant after prolonged isolation inside darkness beneath the camp. As one considers what these returning prisoners represented to the wider inmate population, it becomes clear they became living warnings demonstrating the hidden terror operating below Block 11. Yet many prisoners taken underground never returned at all. The basement contained starvation cells, standing cells, suffocation chambers, execution spaces, and punishment rooms where inmates could disappear completely from ordinary camp life. Fellow prisoners often never learned exactly what happened to those vanished underground because records remained incomplete, executions occurred secretly, and fear silenced open discussion. As one reflects on these disappearances, it becomes evident that the basement functioned almost like a void within Auschwitz itself, a hidden world where prisoners vanished into darkness beyond ordinary human visibility. The emotional effect of these disappearances spread constantly throughout the camp population. Prisoners marching toward labor details above ground past Block 11 while knowing starvation, suffocation, torture, and death unfolded beneath their feet. Rumors circulated continuously about underground punishment chambers while prisoners wondered who might disappear below next. Some inmates later described avoiding looking directly toward guards stationed near Block 11 because fear itself became overwhelming whenever prisoners approached the building. As one considers the psychological impact of this atmosphere, it becomes clear that the underground basement controlled prisoners far beyond those physically imprisoned there because terror spread through uncertainty and imagination across Auschwitz itself. Certain disappearances became especially haunting because prisoners sometimes heard traces of life still coming from underground after inmates vanished below. Survivors later described hearing faint voices, coughing, footsteps, weakened cries or sounds, echoing through basement corridors while prisoners above ground remained powerless to help those trapped underground. Others remembered moments when sounds from particular cells suddenly stopped entirely, leaving prisoners uncertain whether inmates below had died or simply become too weak to speak any longer. As one reflects on these memories, it becomes evident that the basement represented a hidden world of suffering operating directly beneath ordinary camp routines while remaining largely inaccessible to those above. Guards and camp officials used these disappearances deliberately because uncertainty created fear more powerful than many visible punishments. Public executions already terrorized prisoners openly, yet the basement introduced another form of domination based upon invisibility itself. Prisoner taken. Underground might return physically shattered or might vanish permanently without explanation. Fellow inmates therefore lived with constant awareness that hidden punishment existed beneath the camp beyond what they could fully see or understand. As one considers this system, it becomes clear that secrecy itself became another weapon inside Auschwitz. Families, names, and identities also disappeared inside the basement system. Many prisoners taken underground had already lost homes, belongings, and connections to ordinary life through deportation and imprisonment. Once beneath Block 11, some vanished completely without surviving witnesses capable of explaining what happened to them. Fellow inmates sometimes remembered only fragments, a face seen during roll call, a whispered conversation, or memory of someone. March toward the basement one final time. As one reflects on these absences, it becomes evident that the underground cells represented another stage in the broader process of erasure, operating throughout Auschwitz. Yet, even within this atmosphere of disappearance and fear, fragments of memory survived. Certain prisoners later testified about inmates taken underground, while survivors carried recollections of vanished prisoners beyond liberation. Administrative fragments preserved testimony, and survivor accounts sometimes restored traces of those who disappeared beneath Block 11. As one considers the significance of these surviving memories, it becomes clear that total erasure ultimately failed because witnesses preserved fragments of truth. Despite the secrecy surrounding the underground basement, the cells beneath Block 11 also revealed how deeply hidden suffering operated inside Auschwitz itself. Public brutality above ground already dominated prisoner life daily, yet beneath the camp another concealed layer of punishment unfolded through starvation, isolation, suffocation, darkness, and disappearance. Prisoners vanished underground while ordinary camp routines continued above them almost normally. This separation carried enormous symbolic meaning because the basement represented a hidden world operating beneath visible imprisonment itself. As one reflects on this structure, it becomes evident that Auschwitz functioned through both visible terror and concealed terror simultaneously. Ultimately, the prisoners who disappeared into the basement reveal one of the most psychologically devastating aspects of the underground cells hidden beneath Auschwitz. Prisoners vanished below the camp into starvation, suffocation, isolation, darkness, and uncertainty, while fellow inmates above ground remained haunted by unanswered questions and fear. The basement of Block 11 became a place where disappearance itself became punishment, because prisoners could descend underground and never emerge again. Yet, despite the secrecy surrounding those vanishings, survivors later carried memory of the disappeared beyond Auschwitz, ensuring the hidden suffering beneath the camp would never remain buried completely. Chapter 2. Segment 1. What prisoners experienced below ground. As one moves beyond understanding the structure of the underground cells beneath Auschwitz I, and begins examining what daily existence actually felt like for prisoners trapped there, it becomes increasingly clear that the basement of Block 11 was designed not merely to confine human beings but to dismantle their sense of time, identity, physical strength, and psychological stability through isolation, darkness, uncertainty, and deprivation. Unlike ordinary barracks where prisoners still saw other inmates, heard daily camp routines, and remained connected in some limited way to life above ground, the underground cells cut prisoners away from nearly everything familiar. The moment the heavy door closed behind an inmate, the world changed completely. Sounds became distant and distorted. Light often disappeared almost entirely. Time itself began to lose meaning. As one reflects on this transition, it becomes evident that imprisonment underground represented a different category of suffering even within the already brutal reality of Auschwitz. One of the first experiences many prisoners encountered underground was overwhelming darkness. In several basement cells, natural light barely entered or did not enter at all. Prisoners accustomed to seeing the camp yard, barracks, fences, guards, and work details suddenly found themselves surrounded by blackness so complete that they could not see their own hands clearly. At first, many inmates attempted to orient themselves by touching walls, floors, and doors, trying to understand the dimensions of the space trapping them. Yet over time, the darkness became psychologically oppressive because the mind constantly searched for visual reference points and found none. As one considers this environment, it becomes clear that darkness itself functioned as a weapon because it removed one of the most basic ways human beings understand their surroundings. Time quickly became another casualty of underground imprisonment. Without sunlight, changing weather, daily work schedules, or visible movement around the camp, prisoners often lost track of hours and days. Some survivors later described trying desperately to estimate time by counting heartbeats, measuring periods of wakefulness and sleep, or listening for distant sounds from above ground. Yet exhaustion, hunger, thirst, and stress gradually disrupted even these efforts. As one reflects on this loss of temporal awareness, it becomes evident that prisoners underground experienced not only physical confinement but also disorientation so severe that reality itself sometimes felt unstable. Hunger and thirst frequently dominated every thought. Prisoners placed in starvation cells received little or nothing to sustain them physically, while the body gradually consumed its own reserves. At first, hunger appeared as painful discomfort. Later, it transformed into weakness, dizziness, confusion, and physical collapse. Thirst often became even more unbearable. Survivors later described dry mouths, difficulty swallowing, headaches, and overwhelming desire for water that eventually overshadowed almost every other thought. As one considers these experiences, it becomes clear that deprivation underground attacked the body methodically, reducing prisoners to a struggle for the most basic requirements of survival. The silence underground carried its own psychological weight. In some cells, prisoners heard almost nothing for extended periods except their own breathing, occasional footsteps in distant corridors, or faint sounds from neighboring chambers. Human beings are social by nature, and prolonged isolation often produced anxiety, fear, and emotional instability. Some inmates spoke aloud simply to hear a human voice, even if it was there. Others whispered prayers, repeated memories, or mentally rehearsed conversations from earlier life in an effort to remain psychologically anchored. As one reflects on these coping mechanisms, it becomes evident that prisoners fought not only against physical suffering but also against the danger of psychological disintegration. Yet silence was not always complete. Certain prisoners later recalled hearing coughs, groans, whispered voices, or faint tapping sounds from nearby cells. These sounds carried enormous emotional significance because they proved other human beings remained alive nearby. Some inmates attempted communicating through walls, using knocks or whispered messages whenever opportunities arose. Even the briefest exchange could provide comfort in an environment specifically designed to isolate. As one considers these moments, it becomes clear that human connection remained valuable even when reduced to a few words exchanged through stone walls in darkness. Fear remained constant because prisoners rarely knew why they had been placed underground or what would happen next. Some awaited further punishment. Others faced execution. Certain inmates hoped release might come while simultaneously fearing each approaching footstep. Every sound in the corridor carried uncertainty. When guards approached, prisoners did not know whether food, punishment, interrogation, transfer, or death awaited them. As one reflects on this uncertainty, it becomes evident that anticipation itself became a source of suffering because the mind constantly prepared for possibilities it could neither predict nor control. Physical discomfort intensified continuously. Basement cells often remained damp, cold, cramped, and poorly ventilated. Prisoners lacked adequate bedding and frequently sat or lay directly on hard surfaces. Standing cells forced inmates into unnatural positions for extended periods, while overcrowding created exhaustion and pain. Limited movement caused muscles to stiffen while hunger weakened the body further. As one considers these conditions, it becomes clear that underground imprisonment transformed ordinary bodily functions into sources of continual suffering. Memory often became one of the few psychological refuges available. Survivors later described thinking constantly about family members, homes, childhood experiences, favorite foods, conversations, and ordinary moments from life before imprisonment. These memories provided emotional connection to a world beyond the basement walls. Yet memories could also deepen suffering because they reminded. Paradox, it becomes evident that memory simultaneously offered comfort and pain within the underground cells. Religious faith also played an important role for some inmates. Prayers, whispered in darkness, provided structure, hope, and meaning amid conditions designed to produce despair. Certain prisoners later described repeating familiar prayers repeatedly because the words offered psychological stability when almost everything else had been stripped away. Others found strength through personal convictions, determination to survive, or commitment to loved ones waiting beyond the camp. As one considers these forms of resilience, it becomes clear that even underground beneath Auschwitz, prisoners continued searching for reasons to endure. The basement also altered prisoners' perception of the outside world. Sounds drifting from above ground became reminders that ordinary camp life continued while they remained trapped below. Footsteps, doors closing, distant voices, or movement overhead reinforced separation from the rest of humanity. Some inmates later described imagining what might be occurring above them, because imagination became one of the few ways to escape mentally from confinement. As one reflects on these experiences, it becomes evident that imprisonment underground created not only physical isolation but also profound emotional separation from the world beyond the cell. Ultimately, what prisoners experienced below ground reveals one of the most psychologically devastating aspects of Auschwitz: darkness, hunger, thirst, isolation, uncertainty, physical discomfort, and fear combined to create an environment specifically designed to weaken both body and mind. Yet even within these conditions, prisoners searched for connection, memory, faith, and hope. The underground cells attempted to reduce human existence to suffering alone, but many inmates continued resisting through the simple determination to remain mentally and emotionally alive despite the darkness surrounding them. As one continues exploring the hidden world beneath Auschwitz, it becomes increasingly clear that the true horror of the underground basement cells cannot be understood fully through descriptions of walls, doors, or physical structures alone because the deepest suffering emerged from what prisoners actually experienced while trapped there day after day in darkness, uncertainty, and isolation. The underground chambers beneath Block 11 represented an environment where ordinary human routines disappeared almost completely. Above ground, even within the brutality of Auschwitz, prisoners could observe movement, hear camp activity, see changing weather, and interact occasionally with others. Below ground, many of those connections vanished. The basement became a separate reality governed by silence, deprivation, fear, and waiting. As one reflects on this difference, it becomes evident that imprisonment underground was designed not simply to punish behavior but to break the human spirit by stripping away nearly every element of normal existence. Darkness often dominated prisoners' first impressions upon entering the cells. In many chambers, little natural light penetrated the basement, leaving inmates surrounded by shadows or complete blackness. Human beings rely heavily on sight to understand space, measure distance, and maintain orientation, yet underground prisoners frequently lost those reference points almost immediately. Some survivors later described reaching out repeatedly to touch walls, floors, and doors simply to reassure themselves that the physical world still existed around them. Others remembered feeling trapped inside an endless void despite being confined within a relatively small room. As one considers these reactions, it becomes clear that darkness itself became an active force shaping psychological experience inside the basement. Time gradually lost meaning underground. Without visible sunlight, work schedules, roll calls, or daily routines, prisoners struggled to distinguish 1 hour from the next. Some attempted counting silently or creating personal systems for tracking time, but hunger, exhaustion, and stress often disrupted these efforts. Days seemed endless while memories of previous days became increasingly difficult to separate. As one reflects on this loss of temporal awareness, it becomes evident that prisoners experienced a form of disorientation, extending beyond physical confinement because they could no longer measure their place within the passage of time itself. Hunger and thirst frequently became overwhelming. Prisoners confined in starvation cells endured progressive physical deterioration as food and water remained unavailable or severely restricted. At first, the body demanded nourishment insistently, producing pain and discomfort. Later, weakness, dizziness, confusion, and exhaustion became dominant. Thirst often reached unbearable intensity. Survivors described cracked lips, dry throats, headaches, and obsessive thoughts about water. As one considers these experiences, it becomes clear that deprivation underground reduced existence to a struggle focused almost entirely on basic survival. Isolation compounded every other form of suffering. Human beings normally depend on interaction, conversation, and social connection for emotional stability, yet underground prisoners often spent long periods alone or nearly alone. The absence of meaningful human contact intensified fear and uncertainty. Some inmates later described talking quietly to themselves, repeating names of loved ones, or recalling conversations from earlier life simply to maintain a sense of connection with humanity. As one reflects on these coping strategies, it becomes evident that prisoners fought continuously against loneliness as well as against physical hardship. Yet even small sounds carried enormous importance. A cough from a neighboring cell, a faint voice, a whispered word, or a series of knocks on a wall could provide reassurance that another person remained alive nearby. Certain prisoners attempted creating informal communication systems through tapping patterns or whispered exchanges whenever circumstances allowed. These moments often lasted only seconds, yet survivors later remembered them vividly because they represented proof that human connection had not disappeared entirely. As one considers these interactions, it becomes clear that companionship retained extraordinary value even when reduced to the most minimal forms imaginable. Fear remained constant because prisoners rarely understood their fate. Some awaited interrogation. Others expected execution. Certain inmates hoped release might come while simultaneously preparing for the possibility of death. Every sound approaching from the corridor produced uncertainty. Footsteps might signal food, punishment, transfer, or execution. The inability to predict events created persistent anxiety that drained emotional energy continuously. As one reflects on this atmosphere, it becomes evident that uncertainty itself functioned as a form of punishment because prisoners could never achieve psychological stability while their future remained completely unknown. Physical discomfort affected nearly every aspect of daily existence underground. Damp air, cold temperatures, hard floors, overcrowding, poor ventilation, and limited movement produced continual pain and exhaustion. Prisoners confined in standing cells endured particularly severe physical strain because they lacked space to rest properly. Muscles stiffened, joints ached, and weakness intensified as deprivation continued. As one considers these conditions, it becomes clear that the basement attacked the body relentlessly through accumulation of discomfort rather than through a single dramatic act of violence. Memory became both refuge and burden. Many prisoners spent hours recalling family members, childhood experiences, homes, favorite places, and ordinary moments from life before deportation. These memories helped preserve personal identity within an environment designed to reduce individuals to anonymous prisoners. Yet, memories also intensified grief because they highlighted everything lost through imprisonment. As one reflects on this dual role, it becomes evident that memory offered emotional survival while simultaneously reminding inmates of profound absence. Faith, hope, and personal determination often played critical roles in endurance. Some prisoners prayed repeatedly, finding comfort in familiar words spoken within unfamiliar darkness. Others focused on loved ones, imagining reunion after liberation even when circumstances offered little objective reason for optimism. Certain inmates simply resolved to survive one more hour, then another, concentrating on immediate endurance rather than distant possibilities. As one considers these forms of resilience, it becomes clear that survival underground depended partly upon preserving some inner source of special significance. Footsteps, distant voices, doors opening and closing, or movement overhead reminded prisoners that life continued beyond the basement walls. These sounds sometimes provided comfort because they confirmed connection to a larger world. At other times, they intensified suffering by emphasizing separation from that world. As one reflects on these experiences, it becomes evident that the underground cells created a psychological boundary, dividing prisoners not only from freedom but also from ordinary human existence itself. Ultimately, what prisoners experienced below ground reveals the true purpose of the underground punishment system. The basement sought to isolate individuals from light, time, comfort, certainty, and human connection while subjecting them to hunger, thirst, fear, and physical hardship. Yet despite those conditions, many prisoners preserved memory, faith, communication, and hope. The underground cells attempted to reduce existence to suffering and silence, but survivors later demonstrated that even in darkness beneath Auschwitz, elements of humanity endured. Chapter 2. Segment 2. The sounds coming from behind the walls. As one continues descending deeper into the reality of life beneath Auschwitz, it becomes increasingly clear that for many prisoners trapped inside the underground basement cells of Block 11, sound became one of the few remaining connections to the outside world because darkness often erased sight entirely while isolation stripped away nearly every normal point of human contact. In such conditions, the smallest noise could take on enormous significance. A distant footstep, a cough from a neighboring cell, the scraping of a door, the movement of guards through the corridor, or a faint whisper penetrating the thick walls could become the only evidence that life still existed beyond the darkness surrounding a prisoner. As one reflects on this environment, it becomes evident that sound itself transformed into a psychological lifeline inside the underground prison system because prisoners depended upon what they could hear to understand the hidden world around them. The basement beneath Block 11 rarely remained completely silent. Even during long periods when darkness dominated the cells, sounds drifted through corridors, ventilation openings, cracks in walls, and beneath heavy doors. Some prisoners later described hearing footsteps echoing through the underground passages. At first, these sounds often inspired fear because footsteps usually signaled the approach of guards whose arrival could mean punishment, interrogation, transfer, or even execution. Yet over time prisoners listened carefully to distinguish different patterns of movement. Certain footsteps belonged to guards. Others belonged to prisoners being led through the corridors. As one considers this constant attention to sound, it becomes clear that listening became a survival skill because prisoners used noises to interpret events they could not see directly. One of the most haunting sounds remembered by survivors involved the opening and closing of cell doors. The heavy doors of the underground chambers produced distinctive echoes that carried through the basement. Prisoners trapped in darkness often counted how many doors opened, how many closed, and where the sounds originated. Sometimes these noises indicated new prisoners arriving below. Other times they suggested someone had been removed from a cell. Yet prisoners rarely knew the full meaning behind what they heard. As one reflects on this uncertainty, it becomes evident that every sound carried possibilities both hopeful and terrifying because prisoners constantly searched for clues regarding their own fate and the fate of others. Voices represented another powerful presence within the basement. In some cases, prisoners heard guards shouting orders, conducting interrogations, or issuing punishments. The language, tone, and intensity of these voices often communicated fear even when individual words remained unclear. Certain survivors later described hearing angry commands followed by silence, leaving prisoners to imagine what might be happening beyond their own cells. As one considers these experiences, it becomes clear that voices carried emotional weight far beyond ordinary conversation because they reminded prisoners of the authority controlling every aspect of their existence underground. Yet not all voices belonged to guards. Some prisoners heard whispers from neighboring cells. These sounds often provided immense psychological comfort because they proved another human being remained alive nearby. A whispered word, a prayer, a question, or even a brief exchange through cracks and walls could become profoundly meaningful. Certain inmates later described introducing themselves quietly to unseen prisoners occupying adjacent chambers. Others exchanged names, encouragement, or fragments of personal stories. As one reflects on these moments, it becomes evident that communication itself became an act of resistance because prisoners preserved human connection within an environment designed specifically to eliminate. Coughing frequently echoed through the basement corridors. Disease, weakness, hunger, cold temperatures, and poor ventilation affected many prisoners underground, making coughing a common sound. Yet even such painful noises carried significance because they confirmed the presence of life. Some survivors later remembered recognizing individual prisoners through distinctive coughs heard repeatedly over time. When those sounds suddenly stopped, anxiety often followed because silence might indicate transfer, collapse, illness, or death. As one considers this reality, it becomes clear that ordinary bodily sounds acquired extraordinary emotional importance inside the underground cells. The basement also contained sounds associated with suffering. Survivors later described hearing groans, cries, weakened voices, or movements from prisoners enduring starvation, exhaustion, or punishment. These noises often reminded inmates of their own vulnerability because every prisoner understood similar suffering could become their fate. Yet many prisoners also experienced helplessness because thick walls and locked doors prevented meaningful assistance. As one reflects on these experiences, it becomes evident that sound connected prisoners emotionally even when physical separation remained absolute. One particularly important form of communication involved tapping on walls. Certain prisoners developed simple methods of exchanging messages through knocks and rhythmic tapping. These communications often remained basic because complex conversations proved difficult, yet even minimal interaction provided reassurance. A few taps might confirm another prisoner remained alive. Repeated patterns could communicate encouragement or recognition. As one considers these improvised systems, it becomes clear that prisoners sought connection through any means available despite severe restrictions imposed by the underground environment. Sounds from above ground also drifted occasionally into the basement. Footsteps crossing floors overhead, distant camp activity, doors opening elsewhere in the building, or movement outside reminded prisoners that life continued beyond the underground cells. For some inmates, these sounds provided comfort because they reinforced awareness of a larger world beyond confinement. For others, they intensified suffering because they emphasized separation from ordinary human existence. As one reflects on this dual effect, it becomes evident that even indirect contact with the outside world carried complex emotional meaning underground. The approach of guards often produced immediate tension throughout the basement. Prisoners listened carefully whenever footsteps entered the corridor because uncertainty accompanied every movement. Guards might deliver food, conduct inspections, remove prisoners, impose punishment, or carry out executions. The inability to predict outcomes transformed ordinary sounds into sources of anxiety. As one considers this atmosphere, it becomes clear that anticipation itself became a form of psychological pressure because prisoners remained constantly alert to noises that might signal dramatic changes in their circumstances. Silence itself also carried meaning. After extended periods of listening to voices, coughing, footsteps, or tapping, sudden silence often felt unnatural and disturbing. Prisoners sometimes worried when familiar sounds disappeared because absence could indicate illness, transfer, or death. As one reflects on these reactions, it becomes evident that silence underground was never truly empty. Instead, it became filled with questions, fears, and imagined possibilities. Ultimately, the sounds coming from behind the walls reveal how prisoners experienced life beneath Auschwitz through senses, sharpened by darkness and isolation. Footsteps, voices, coughing, tapping, doors, and distant noises became essential sources of information, comfort, fear, and connection. The underground cells attempted to isolate individuals completely, yet sound continued crossing barriers the walls could not entirely stop. Through listening, prisoners maintained fragile links to one another and to the world beyond the darkness surrounding them. As one continues exploring the hidden existence beneath Auschwitz it becomes increasingly clear that for many prisoners trapped inside the underground cells of Block 11, sound became one of the most important elements of survival because darkness often removed visual awareness almost entirely, while isolation severed ordinary forms of human contact. Inside the basement, prisoners frequently depended upon their ears more than their eyes to understand what was happening around them. Every noise carried meaning. Every echo suggested movement somewhere beyond the walls. Every voice hinted at the presence of another human being. As one reflects on this environment, it becomes evident that sound transformed into a vital psychological connection between prisoners and the hidden world surrounding them because hearing remained one of the few senses capable of reaching beyond locked doors and thick stone walls. The underground basement produced a unique acoustic environment where sounds traveled unpredictably through corridors, ventilation openings, cracks, and structural spaces within the building. Prisoners often heard footsteps long before they could identify their source. These echoes became deeply familiar over time. Some inmates later described learning to distinguish different patterns of movement, recognizing when guards approached, when prisoners were being escorted, or when activity increased within particular sections of the basement. As one considers these experiences, it becomes clear that listening evolved into a form of observation because prisoners relied on sound to gather information otherwise unavailable to them. The opening of doors remained among the most significant sounds underground. Heavy cell doors generated distinctive noises that reverberated through the basement. Prisoners trapped in darkness listened carefully whenever a door opened because such moments often signaled important events. A door might indicate the arrival of a new prisoner, the removal of someone from confinement, delivery of supplies, interrogation, punishment, or transfer. Yet uncertainty always accompanied these sounds because prisoners rarely possessed enough information to understand their full meaning. As one reflects on this uncertainty, it becomes evident that even routine noises carried emotional power within an environment dominated by fear and anticipation. Voices often traveled through the basement corridors, guards issuing commands, conducting interrogations, or communicating with one another created a constant reminder of authority. Prisoners listened not only to words but also to tone, volume, and emotional intensity. Angry voices suggested danger while calm voices sometimes indicated ordinary administrative activity. Certain survivors later recalled moments when raised voices echoed through the basement followed by silence, leaving prisoners to imagine what might have occurred. As one considers these experiences, it becomes clear that voices functioned as emotional signals influencing the atmosphere throughout the underground prison. Yet the most meaningful voices frequently belonged to fellow prisoners. A whisper from a neighboring cell could provide reassurance stronger than any physical comfort available. Underground, prisoners sometimes exchanged names, greetings, prayers, or brief messages. through cracks, ventilation openings, or thin sections of wall. These conversations often remained limited because guards monitored communication and conditions made speaking difficult. Nevertheless, even a few words could restore a sense of human connection. As one reflects on these exchanges, it becomes evident that communication represented a form of resistance against the isolation imposed by the underground cells. Coughing, breathing, and other ordinary human sounds acquired extraordinary significance within the basement. Disease, hunger, weakness, poor ventilation, and cold conditions affected many prisoners, making coughing particularly common. Survivors later described recognizing neighboring inmates through recurring sounds heard over days or weeks. Familiar noises became evidence of continued survival. When those sounds suddenly disappeared, concern often followed because silence might indicate deterioration, transfer, or death. As one considers this reality, it becomes clear that prisoners monitored one another indirectly through sound, creating emotional connections despite physical separation. Certain noises reflected suffering more directly. Groans, cries, weakened voices, and movements from neighboring cells reminded prisoners constantly of the hardships endured throughout the basement. These sounds often intensified fear because they demonstrated the consequences of starvation, exhaustion, punishment, and illness. At the same time, they fostered empathy because prisoners understood the suffering belonged to people experiencing circumstances similar to their. As one reflects on these reactions, it becomes evident that sound created a shared emotional landscape even among inmates who never saw one another. Tapping systems emerged as one of the most remarkable forms of underground communication. Prisoners sometimes developed simple codes using knocks against walls or pipes. These systems varied in complexity, but even the most basic patterns allowed individuals to acknowledge one another's presence. A few taps could communicate survival. Repeated signals could offer encouragement. In an environment designed to isolate completely, such exchanges carried profound importance. As one considers these improvised networks, it becomes clear that human beings consistently seek connection even under extreme conditions. Sounds drifting from above ground possessed unique emotional significance. Prisoners occasionally heard footsteps crossing floors overhead, doors opening. Elsewhere in the building, distant voices, or activity associated with ordinary camp operations. These noises reminded inmates that another world existed beyond the basement. For some prisoners, this awareness provided hope because it suggested continued connection to life outside the cell. For others, it deepened loneliness by emphasizing separation from that world. As one reflects on these contrasting responses, it becomes evident that the same sound could inspire comfort and despair simultaneously depending upon the listener's state of mind. The approach of guards remained particularly stressful. Footsteps entering the corridor often caused immediate anxiety because prisoners never knew what would follow. Guards controlled food, punishment, transfers, interrogations, and access to the outside world. Every approaching sound, therefore, carried uncertainty. As one considers this atmosphere, it becomes clear that prisoners existed in a constant state of alertness shaped partly by the unpredictable meanings attached to ordinary noises. Silence itself carried emotional weight. Long periods without sound often produced unease because prisoners relied on auditory information to understand their surroundings. When familiar voices, coughs, or tapping patterns disappeared, inmates sometimes feared the worst. Silence could indicate absence, illness, punishment, or death. As one reflects on these reactions, it becomes evident that silence underground was not merely absence of noise but a powerful psychological presence filled with unanswered questions. Ultimately, the sounds coming from behind the walls reveal how prisoners adapted to life within the underground cells. In darkness, where sight failed and isolation dominated, listening became essential. Footsteps, voices, tapping, coughing, doors, and distant camp activity provided information, emotional support, warnings, and reminders of human existence beyond the cell. The underground prison attempted to sever every connection, yet sound continued crossing barriers, allowing fragments of communication and humanity to survive beneath Auschwitz despite the darkness surrounding them. Chapter 2. Segment 3. Hope, Fear, and Survival Beneath the Camp. As one continues deeper into the hidden world beneath Auschwitz, it becomes increasingly clear that the underground cells of Block 11 were not merely places of physical confinement but battlegrounds of the mind where hope, fear, memory, despair, and survival fought constantly against one another inside conditions specifically designed to crush the human spirit. Above ground, prisoners endured starvation, forced labor, violence, disease, and exhaustion, yet they still existed within a visible world where they could see other inmates, hear daily routines, and observe the passage of time through changing weather and daylight. Underground, much of that disappeared. Prisoners trapped below the camp entered an environment where darkness concealed the future. Isolation severed normal human connections, and uncertainty dominated every waking moment. As one reflects on this reality, it becomes evident that survival beneath the camp depended not only on physical endurance but also on preserving some inner reason to continue living despite conditions that offered almost none. Fear remained the most constant companion for many prisoners trapped underground. The moment a cell door closed behind an inmate, uncertainty took control. Few prisoners understood exactly how long they would remain imprisoned below. Some feared execution, others feared starvation, suffocation, torture, or permanent disappearance. Every sound in the corridor carried potential danger because footsteps approaching the cell could signal punishment, interrogation, transfer, or death. As one considers the psychological pressure created by this uncertainty, it becomes clear that fear underground operated differently from fear above ground. In the barracks or labor details, threats often appeared visible and immediate. Beneath Block 11, fear thrived in darkness because prisoners rarely knew what was happening beyond the walls surrounding them. The imagination, therefore, became both enemy and companion. In darkness where little information existed, the mind filled empty spaces with possibilities. Prisoners wondered what had happened to neighboring inmates. They imagined what guards might be discussing beyond the door. They questioned whether liberation, execution, or continued imprisonment awaited them. Some survivors later described moments when uncertainty became almost unbearable because the human mind naturally seeks answers even when none are available. As one reflects on these experiences, it becomes evident that psychological survival required managing not only real dangers but also the countless fears generated by uncertainty itself. Yet hope persisted even within this darkness. For some prisoners, hope appeared in surprisingly small forms. A sound from a neighboring cell might suggest another inmate remained alive nearby. A whispered conversation could provide emotional support. The arrival of food, however limited, might indicate continued survival for another day. A distant Noise from above ground could remind prisoners that the world beyond the basement still existed. As one considers these moments, it becomes clear that hope underground often depended upon details so small they might seem insignificant elsewhere, yet within the basement they carried extraordinary meaning because they connected prisoners to possibilities beyond immediate suffering. Memory played a crucial role in maintaining hope. Many inmates spent long hours recalling family members, homes, childhood experiences, friendships, and ordinary moments from life before imprisonment. These memories preserved personal identity within an environment designed to reduce individuals to anonymous prisoners. A father remembered children waiting somewhere beyond the camp. A mother recalled family gatherings. Others imagined familiar streets, favorite meals, or conversations from years earlier. As one reflects on the importance of these memories, it becomes evident that they provided psychological refuge, because they reminded prisoners that life existed beyond the underground cells and that they had once belonged to a world larger than Auschwitz. Yet memory could also intensify suffering. Recalling loved ones sometimes deepened grief because prisoners knew many family members had likely disappeared within the machinery of deportation and extermination. Familiar places existed only in imagination while reality remained a dark underground chamber. As one considers this contradiction, it becomes clear that memory served as both comfort and pain simultaneously, preserving identity while highlighting loss. Religious faith offered another source of endurance. For certain prisoners, some survivors later described repeating prayers silently in darkness, because familiar words provided structure when ordinary routines had vanished. Faith helped some inmates interpret suffering within a larger framework of meaning, while others found strength through personal beliefs, moral convictions, or commitment to surviving for the sake of loved ones. As one reflects on these experiences, it becomes evident that spiritual resilience often became as important as physical endurance beneath the camp. Human connection remained essential whenever it could be maintained. Even brief communication with neighboring prisoners helped combat isolation. A whispered greeting, a few taps against a wall, or recognition that another person remained alive nearby could strengthen emotional resilience. Certain inmates later described feeling renewed determination after hearing another prisoner speak because such moments reminded them they were not completely alone. As one considers the significance of these interactions, it becomes clear that solidarity survived even within spaces designed specifically to eliminate it. Fear and hope often existed simultaneously. A prisoner might fear execution while still hoping for release. Someone suffering from hunger and weakness could imagine future freedom despite overwhelming odds. Others focused on surviving one more hour, rather than contemplating distant possibilities. As one reflects on this coexistence, it becomes evident that survival rarely depended upon absolute optimism. Instead, many prisoners endured because they maintained enough hope to continue despite overwhelming reasons for despair. Physical survival became increasingly difficult as deprivation continued. Hunger weakened muscles, thirst impaired thinking, cold temperatures drained energy, and isolation affected mental stability. Yet some prisoners developed routines to preserve control. They repeated prayers, counted silently, exercised within limited space, recalled memories deliberately, or created mental goals. These actions might appear minor, but they helped maintain psychological structure within an environment designed to remove it. As one considers these strategies, it becomes clear that Survival often depended upon preserving a sense of agency even when external control remained impossible. The basement also revealed extraordinary resilience. Not every prisoner survived. Underground confinement and suffering remained severe. Yet many individuals demonstrated remarkable ability to adapt psychologically to conditions intended to destroy them. They found meaning in memory, connection in whispered words, hope in small signs of life, and determination within themselves. As one reflects on these acts of endurance, it becomes evident that the underground cells exposed not only cruelty but also the capacity of human beings to resist psychological collapse under extreme circumstances. Ultimately, hope, fear, and survival beneath the camp reveal the true human dimension of the underground cells. These chambers attempted to isolate prisoners from light, certainty, comfort, and connection while subjecting them to darkness, deprivation, and uncertainty. Yet within that environment many inmates continued fighting internally to preserve identity, memory, faith, and hope. The underground prison sought to dominate every aspect of existence, but survivors later demonstrated that even beneath Auschwitz, the human spirit could endure far longer than its captors intended. As one continues exploring the hidden existence beneath Auschwitz it becomes increasingly clear that life inside the underground cells of Block 11 involved a constant struggle between hope and fear because prisoners trapped below the camp existed in an environment specifically designed to weaken the body while gradually attacking the mind through darkness, isolation, uncertainty, and deprivation. The underground basement represented more than a physical prison. It became a psychological landscape where every thought carried unusual significance because inmates possessed so little control over external circumstances. Above ground, prisoners at least remained connected to daily routines, visible movement, and interaction with others. Below ground, those connections often disappeared entirely. As one reflects on this difference, it becomes evident that survival beneath the camp required extraordinary mental resilience as prisoners attempted to preserve some sense of meaning within conditions that seemed determined to erase it. Fear shaped nearly every aspect of underground existence. Prisoners rarely knew why they had been placed in particular cells or how long their confinement would last. Some expected execution at any moment. Others feared starvation, illness, punishment, or permanent disappearance. Every sound approaching from the corridor created uncertainty because guards controlled access to food, movement, information, and life itself. As one considers this atmosphere, it becomes clear that fear underground extended beyond specific threats because uncertainty prevented prisoners from preparing emotionally for what might come next. The mind continuously anticipated possibilities without receiving answers. Isolation intensified these fears. Human beings normally process anxiety through conversation, observation, and social support, yet underground prisoners often lacked those resources. Alone in darkness, individuals confronted thoughts and worries without reassurance from others. Some survivors later described periods when fear seemed overwhelming because they could not distinguish between realistic concerns and imagined dangers. As one reflects on these experiences, it becomes evident that psychological endurance required resisting the tendency to become consumed by uncertainty. Yet hope persisted, even in such conditions. Often it emerged from surprisingly small events. A voice heard through a wall could remind a prisoner that another person remained alive nearby. A guard opening a door might bring evidence that the outside world still existed. A memory of family members waiting somewhere beyond the camp could provide motivation to survive another day. As one considers these moments, it becomes clear that hope underground rarely depended upon dramatic developments. Instead, it survived through small reminders that life extended beyond immediate suffering. Memory frequently became one of the strongest sources of hope. Prisoners recalled homes, relatives, friendships, celebrations, and ordinary experiences from life before imprisonment. These memories preserved continuity between past and present, helping inmates maintain awareness that they possessed identities beyond their status as prisoners. A remembered conversation, a familiar face, or a childhood experience could provide emotional strength during periods of extreme hardship. As one reflects on the role of memory, it becomes evident that recalling the past often helped prisoners imagine a future beyond the basement walls. At the same time, memory sometimes increased pain. Thoughts of loved ones highlighted separation and loss. Familiar places existed only in recollection while reality remained confined to darkness and uncertainty. Certain prisoners worried constantly about the fate of family members deported alongside them or left behind elsewhere. As one considers this contradiction, it becomes clear that memory operated as both refuge and burden, sustaining identity while reminding prisoners of everything taken from them. Faith and personal belief systems provided another foundation for endurance. Some prisoners relied on prayer, repeating familiar words that offered comfort and structure. Others drew strength from moral principles, personal determination, or commitment to surviving for the sake of family members. Even individuals without formal religious faith often developed internal sources of resilience based on values, responsibilities, or simple refusal to surrender psychologically. As one reflects on these forms of strength, it becomes evident that survival beneath the camp depended partly upon maintaining some reason to continue despite overwhelming hardship. Human connection remained invaluable whenever circumstances allowed. A whispered exchange, a tapped message, or recognition that another prisoner occupied a nearby cell could transform emotional experience significantly. These interactions reminded inmates they remained part of a broader human community despite physical isolation. Certain survivors later described moments when hearing another prisoner's voice restored hope more effectively than any material comfort could have done. As one considers these experiences, it becomes clear that solidarity persisted even within environments deliberately designed to prevent. Many prisoners developed personal strategies for survival. Some created mental routines, counting repeatedly or recalling memories in structured ways. Others focused on short-term goals, such as enduring until the next meal, surviving until morning, or maintaining composure through another period of confinement. By concentrating on manageable objectives rather than overwhelming uncertainties, prisoners preserved a sense of control. As one reflects on these coping mechanisms, it becomes evident that resilience often emerged through practical psychological adaptation rather than through grand acts of heroism. The struggle between hope and fear rarely ended. Even prisoners who maintained optimism experienced moments of despair. Likewise, individuals overwhelmed by fear sometimes discovered unexpected sources of strength. Emotional states shifted constantly depending upon physical condition, surrounding events, and available information. As one considers this complexity, it becomes clear that survival underground involved continuous negotiation between opposing psychological forces rather than permanent victory of one over the other. Physical suffering influenced this struggle significantly. Hunger, thirst, exhaustion, illness, and discomfort weakened emotional resilience while making fear more difficult to manage. Yet some prisoners continued finding reasons to endure despite deteriorating conditions. Their determination demonstrated remarkable adaptability under circumstances designed specifically to produce collapse. As one reflects on these examples, it becomes evident that human endurance often exceeded what guards and administrators expected. Ultimately, hope, fear, and survival beneath the camp reveal the deepest reality of the underground cells. These chambers sought to isolate prisoners from light, certainty, comfort, and connection while exposing them to darkness, deprivation, and psychological pressure. Yet many inmates continued preserving memory, faith, identity, and hope despite those conditions. The basement represented one of the harshest environments within Auschwitz, but survivors later showed that even there, human beings could retain elements of dignity and resilience that the underground prison failed to destroy completely. Chapter 3, Segment 1, The Prisoners Who Never Came Back. As one moves deeper into the story of the underground cells hidden beneath Auschwitz, it becomes increasingly clear that one of the most terrifying aspects of Block 11 was not simply what happened inside the basement, but the fact that many prisoners who descended those stairs were never seen again. Throughout Auschwitz, inmates quickly learned that certain destinations inside the camp carried special meaning. The crematoria represented one kind of fear. The punishment details represented another. Yet Block 11 inspired a unique form of dread because it stood as a place where people could disappear completely from the daily rhythms of camp life. Prisoner might be present during morning roll call, working beside others during a labor detail, exchanging whispered conversations in a barrack, and then suddenly be taken away under guard. Hours later, days later, or even weeks later, fellow inmates still would not know what had happened. Some hoped the prisoner had merely been transferred. Others feared the truth. As one reflects on this uncertainty, it becomes evident that disappearance itself became a weapon within Auschwitz. The Nazi administration understood that visible punishment could create fear, but invisible punishment often created even greater terror because it allowed imagination to fill the gaps left by missing information. Prisoners watched men and women vanish into the machinery of the camp every day, yet the underground basement introduced a more intimate kind of disappearance. People did not vanish behind distant fences or onto trains leaving the camp. They disappeared beneath the feet of fellow prisoners, into a hidden world concealed below the very buildings everyone could see. Rumors circulated constantly regarding what happened underground. Some prisoners spoke about starvation cells where inmates were left without food or water until death arrived. Others described standing cells so cramped that people could barely remain upright for entire nights. Stories spread about interrogations, executions, and punishments, carried out away from public view. Because reliable information remained scarce, fear magnified. Every rumor, a single whispered account could travel through barracks and labor details, growing darker with each retelling. Yet what made these stories especially powerful was that prisoners could point toward Block 11 and identify real individuals who had entered the building but never returned. The absence of those prisoners became evidence in itself. Empty sleeping spaces inside barracks, missing faces during roll call, and unanswered questions created constant reminders that the underground cells were consuming human lives. Some survivors later recalled specific individuals whose disappearances remained fixed in memory for decades. They remembered names, faces, conversations, and final moments before guards escorted those prisoners away. Certain inmates were accused of resistance activities. Others were punished following escape attempts, alleged rule violations, or suspicions held by camp authorities. In many cases, fellow prisoners never learned the exact reasons. They only knew that someone had been taken below and had failed to come back. As one considers these memories, it becomes clear that uncertainty amplified grief because prisoners could not even achieve closure. Death itself was often hidden. Behind walls, locked doors, and secrecy, the emotional burden extended beyond personal friendships. Every disappearance reminded inmates of their own vulnerability. If one prisoner could vanish today, another might disappear tomorrow. No one could predict with confidence who would be targeted next. This constant uncertainty weakened any sense of security that prisoners might otherwise have developed. Even within the brutal environment of Auschwitz, human beings naturally searched for patterns that could help them understand danger. Yet the basement often seemed to operate according to rules known only to the authorities. As one reflects on this atmosphere, it becomes evident that unpredictability formed a central part of the terror. Surrounding Block 11, the underground cells also represented a form of erasure. Many prisoners entering the basement had already lost homes, possessions, careers, communities, and family members through deportation. Inside Auschwitz, they were often identified primarily through numbers rather than names. When individuals disappeared into the underground prison and never emerged again, even those remaining fragments of identity risked being lost. Fellow inmates struggled to preserve memories of the missing, repeating names quietly or recalling personal details so that vanished prisoners would not disappear completely from human memory. These small acts of remembrance carried tremendous significance because they challenged the system's attempt to reduce people to anonymous absences. Some prisoners tried to gather information whenever possible. They listened for rumors, questioned new arrivals, and exchanged whispered observations. A report that someone had been seen in a basement corridor could spread quickly. News that a particular prisoner remained alive after several days underground might inspire hope. Yet such information rarely remained reliable. Contradictory stories circulated constantly, leaving prisoners trapped between optimism and despair. As one considers these efforts, it becomes clear that information itself became a precious resource within the camp because knowledge offered at least some resistance against uncertainty. The physical structure of Block 11 reinforced its reputation. Prisoners could see the building, observe guards entering and leaving, and sometimes watch inmates being escorted toward it. Yet the most feared activities occurred below ground, hidden from view. This separation between visible and invisible terror made the basement especially powerful psychologically. Everyone knew something terrible happened there, but few could observe it directly. The unknown, therefore, became almost as frightening as the known. As one reflects on this reality, it becomes evident that secrecy magnified suffering by preventing prisoners from understanding fully what awaited those taken below. Despite the fear surrounding the basement, acts of humanity persisted. Prisoners remembered the missing. They shared stories about those who had disappeared. They preserved fragments of identity through memory when official records and camp procedures threatened to erase them. These acts could not rescue individuals trapped underground, but they prevented total disappearance. Memory became a form of resistance against oblivion. Ultimately, the prisoners who never came back reveal one of the most haunting aspects of life beneath Auschwitz. The underground cells did not merely confine people. They removed them from the visible world of the camp, leaving behind uncertainty, fear, and unanswered questions. Fellow prisoners watched friends, acquaintances, and strangers descend into the basement and vanish. Yet even when bodies disappeared, memories survived. Through remembrance, testimony, and later survivor accounts, those who never returned continued to exist within history long after the doors of Block 11 closed behind them. As one continues exploring the hidden depths beneath Auschwitz I, it becomes increasingly clear that the underground basement of Block 11 functioned not only as a place of punishment but also as a place where countless prisoners simply vanished from the daily life of the camp, leaving behind questions that often remained unanswered even after the war ended. Throughout Auschwitz, death appeared in many forms. Prisoners died from disease, starvation, forced labor, violence, and executions. Yet the disappearances connected to Block 11 carried a different emotional impact because they unfolded behind walls and beneath floors, hidden from ordinary observation. Fellow inmates frequently knew when someone had been taken to the building, but they rarely knew what happened afterward. Days passed. Roll calls came and went. Labor details continued. Barracks filled and emptied. Yet the missing prisoner remained absent. As one reflects on this pattern, it becomes evident that the underground cells created a climate where uncertainty itself became part of the punishment inflicted upon the broader prisoner population. Many inmates feared the basement precisely because it seemed to swallow people without explanation. A prisoner accused of resistance, possession of prohibited items, contact with escape networks, or violations of camp regulations might suddenly be removed from normal routines. Sometimes, guards offered no explanation. Sometimes accusations circulated through rumor alone. In either case, once the prisoner disappeared into Block 11, information became scarce. Fellow inmates attempted to follow developments through whispers and observations, but certainty remained rare. As one considers these circumstances, it becomes clear that the underground prison derived much of its power from secrecy. People fear what they understand, but they often fear what they cannot understand even more. Stories about vanished prisoners spread rapidly through the camp. Certain names became known because individuals had been respected, admired, or simply memorable. Among fellow inmates, prisoners recalled conversations held shortly before arrest, promises to meet again after work details, or ordinary moments that suddenly acquired tragic significance. Once someone disappeared, survivors later described remembering the final sight of particular prisoners being escorted away by guards. Those memories remained vivid because they marked the last confirmed moments before uncertainty took over. As one reflects on these recollections, it becomes evident that the human mind often clings tightly to final encounters when no later answers become available. The emotional consequences affected entire prisoner communities. Friendships existed even within Auschwitz despite conditions designed to destroy social bonds. Prisoners shared food, exchanged information, offered encouragement, and supported one another. Whenever possible, when someone vanished into the basement and failed to return, those connections were abruptly severed. Friends mourned without confirmation. Acquaintances wondered whether survival remained possible. Barrack companions stared at empty spaces where missing prisoners had once slept. As one considers these experiences, it becomes clear that Disappearances produced ongoing psychological wounds because uncertainty prevented emotional resolution. Fear intensified whenever guards appeared unexpectedly. Prisoners understood that removal to Block 11 could happen with little warning. The possibility lingered constantly in the background of daily life. Every inspection, accusation, or confrontation carried potential consequences. As one reflects on this atmosphere, it becomes evident that the underground cells influenced behavior throughout the camp because they served as a reminder of what authorities could do to individuals who attracted attention. The basement therefore exerted control over many more prisoners than those physically confined within its walls. Survivors later recalled hearing fragments of information about conditions underground. Reports described starvation cells, standing cells, and harsh punishments imposed beneath the building. Whether every detail proved accurate mattered less than the overall effect such stories produced. The basement became a symbol of hidden suffering. Prisoners imagined what might be happening below because direct observation remained impossible. In environments dominated by fear, imagination often expands to fill informational gaps. As one considers this process, it becomes clear that the reputation of Block 11 grew partly through reality and partly through the terror generated by uncertainty. Yet, many disappearances reflected genuine tragedy. Historical evidence confirms that prisoners died within the punishment cells beneath Block 11. Some succumbed to starvation, others endured conditions so severe that survival became impossible. Certain inmates faced execution following imprisonment underground. These realities ensured that fears surrounding the basement were not merely products of rumor. They reflected actual dangers hidden below the surface of the camp. As one reflects on these facts, it becomes evident that the underground cells represented one of the most lethal environments within Auschwitz. Despite everything, prisoners continued trying to preserve the memory of those who vanished. Names circulated quietly. Stories survived through conversation. Survivors carried recollections beyond liberation and later shared them with investigators, historians, families, and future generations. Through these acts of remembrance, individuals whom the system attempted to erase remained visible within historical memory. As one considers the significance of this preservation, it becomes clear that memory became a powerful response to disappearance. The camp could remove people physically, but it could not completely eliminate the recollections carried by those who survived. The underground basement, therefore, occupies a unique place within the history of Auschwitz. It represents hidden punishment, secrecy, uncertainty, and death. Yet it also reveals the determination of prisoners to remember one another despite extraordinary pressure to forget. Every vanished prisoner left traces within the minds of fellow inmates. Every unanswered question became part of a larger story about life inside the camp. Ultimately, the prisoners who never came back remind us that the terror of the underground cells extended far beyond those physically confined there. The basement affected everyone who watched friends disappear, everyone who feared becoming the next victim, and everyone who carried memories of the missing long after Auschwitz itself was liberated. Through survivor testimony and historical remembrance, the individuals who vanished beneath Block 11 continue to be remembered, ensuring that their disappearance was never complete. Chapter 3. Segment 2. The Men Who Survived to Tell the Story. As one moves deeper into the final chapter of the underground cells hidden beneath Auschwitz, it becomes increasingly clear that one of the greatest failures of the system operating inside Block 11 was that some prisoners survived. The basement had been designed to isolate, punish, terrify, and in many cases destroy those sent below. Darkness concealed what happened inside the underground chambers. Thick walls prevented outside observation. Starvation cells, standing cells, and punishment rooms operated far from the sight of most inmates. The authorities depended heavily upon secrecy because secrecy amplified fear and reduced accountability. Yet, despite those intentions, not every prisoner disappeared forever. Some emerged from the basement alive. They carried memories of what they had seen, heard, and endured. Years later, after liberation, those memories became some of the most important evidence revealing what had happened beneath the camp. As one reflects on this reality, it becomes evident that survival itself became a form of resistance because every prisoner who lived long enough to testify represented a direct challenge to efforts designed to hide the truth. Many survivors later described the underground basement as one of the most psychologically devastating environments they had ever experienced. Even individuals who had endured forced labor, starvation, disease, and violence elsewhere within Auschwitz often remembered the basement differently because it combined physical suffering with extreme isolation. Darkness dominated daily existence. Time lost, meaning, uncertainty became constant. Prisoners rarely knew why they had been placed there or what awaited them next. As one considers these conditions, it becomes clear that the underground cells attacked the mind as aggressively as they attacked the body. Yet those who survived developed remarkable strategies for endurance. Some focused on preserving routines within their thoughts. Others counted silently, repeated prayers, recalled memories, or concentrated on surviving one more hour at a time. These methods did not eliminate suffering, but they helped maintain psychological stability in circumstances designed to destroy it. Survivors frequently emphasized the importance of memory. Many later explained that they consciously revisited childhood experiences, family stories, familiar places, and personal relationships while trapped underground. These recollections provided emotional refuge because they reminded prisoners that another world existed beyond the walls of Block 11. A man lying in darkness might mentally walk through the streets of his hometown. Another might imagine conversations with parents, siblings, spouses, or children. As one reflects on these practices, it becomes evident that memory functioned as a lifeline connecting prisoners to identities the camp could not entirely erase. The basement attempted to reduce individuals to isolated inmates, yet memory preserved humanity. Beneath the punishment, communication also played a crucial role in survival. Although the underground cells were designed to separate prisoners from one another, complete isolation proved difficult to achieve. Sounds traveled through walls and corridors. Prisoners sometimes heard coughing, footsteps, whispers, or tapping from neighboring cells. In certain cases, inmates developed simple methods of communication through knocks or brief exchanges of words. These interactions often remained limited, but their psychological impact was profound. Hearing another human voice confirmed that one was not completely alone. As one considers these moments, it becomes clear that even the smallest forms of connection could strengthen determination to endure. Certain survivors later described specific individuals whose voices remained memorable decades afterward despite never seeing them directly. Faith provided another source of resilience. For many prisoners, Some recited prayers repeatedly while confined underground. Others reflected on religious teachings, spiritual beliefs, or moral principles that helped them interpret suffering. Faith did not necessarily remove fear. Instead, it often provided structure within chaos and meaning within uncertainty. As one reflects on these experiences, it becomes evident that spiritual conviction allowed certain prisoners to maintain hope even when physical conditions appeared hopeless. The underground cells attempted to isolate individuals from the world, but faith enabled some inmates to feel connected to something larger than their immediate circumstances. Physical survival required extraordinary endurance. Hunger, thirst, cold temperatures, exhaustion, poor ventilation, and lack of movement weakened prisoners steadily. Standing cells imposed severe strain on the body while starvation cells attacked basic survival itself. Yet some inmates survived because of remarkable physical resilience combined with determination. Others survived because periods of confinement eventually ended before conditions became fatal. As one considers these realities, it becomes clear that survival often depended upon a combination of personal strength, circumstance, and chance. No single factor guaranteed endurance underground. The testimonies provided by survivors after liberation became invaluable. They described conditions within the basement, explained how punishments operated, and documented experiences otherwise hidden from view. Through their accounts, historians gained insight into aspects of Auschwitz that official records alone could never fully capture. Survivors explained what darkness felt like, how uncertainty affected the mind, and how prisoners attempted to communicate through walls. These details transformed abstract descriptions into human experiences. As one reflects on the importance of testimony, it becomes evident that survivors served as living evidence against attempts to conceal what had happened. Beneath Block 11, many survivors struggled emotionally while sharing their memories. Recounting experiences from the basement often required revisiting trauma they had spent years attempting to manage. Some described feeling as though they returned mentally to the underground cells whenever they spoke about them. Yet, despite these difficulties, many chose to testify because they believed remembrance mattered. As one considers this decision, it becomes clear that telling the story involved its own form of courage. Survival did not end when prisoners left the basement. For many, survival continued through the difficult work of remembering and speaking. The stories told by survivors also challenged the goals of the underground punishment system. The basement had been designed partly around secrecy. Prisoners entered spaces hidden from ordinary observation. Authorities controlled information tightly. Yet every testimony weakened that secrecy. Every account illuminated another aspect of life beneath the camp. As one reflects on this process, it becomes evident that memory gradually dismantled the silence surrounding Block 11. Survivors transformed private suffering into public knowledge. Their words ensured that experiences once hidden underground would become part of historical understanding. Ultimately, the men who survived to tell the story reveal one of the most important truths about the underground cells. The basement sought to isolate, punish, and erase individuals from view. Yet some prisoners endured. They carried memories beyond the walls of Auschwitz and shared those memories with future generations. Through testimony, recollection, and historical documentation, they exposed conditions the underground prison had attempted to conceal. Their survival ensured that the darkness beneath Block 11 would not remain hidden forever. As one continues exploring the hidden history beneath Auschwitz I, it becomes increasingly clear that the existence of survivors represents one of the most powerful reasons historians understand the underground cells at all, because without those who lived through imprisonment beneath Block 11, much of what occurred there would remain obscured behind walls, missing records, and the silence that often surrounds hidden suffering. The basement was designed to operate away from public view. Prisoners entering its corridors frequently disappeared from ordinary camp life. Some never returned. Others emerged physically weakened and emotionally scarred. Yet a number survived long enough to share their experiences after liberation. Their testimonies transformed isolated memories into historical evidence. As one reflects on this reality, it becomes evident that survival carried responsibilities many former prisoners never expected to bear. They became witnesses not only for themselves but also for countless individuals who never had the opportunity to speak. Many survivors later explained that one of the most difficult aspects of underground confinement involved uncertainty. Physical hardship remained severe, but uncertainty intensified every other form of suffering. Prisoners did not know how long imprisonment would continue. They rarely understood what decisions authorities were making outside their cells. Information remained scarce. As one considers these conditions, it becomes clear that uncertainty attacked psychological stability directly, because human beings naturally seek explanations, patterns, and expectations. The basement denied those comforts almost completely, yet survivors learned to adapt. Some focused deliberately on immediate concerns, rather than distant possibilities. Instead of wondering endlessly about the future, they concentrated on enduring the present moment. This mental adjustment often proved essential for survival. Survivors also described the importance of maintaining identity. Auschwitz sought to reduce individuals to prisoner numbers, while the underground cells added further isolation. Yet, many inmates resisted internally by preserving memories of who they had been before. Teacher remembered lessons taught years earlier. A father imagined conversations with his children. A craftsman recalled the details of work once performed in freedom. As one reflects on these recollections, it becomes evident that identity itself became a form of resistance. The basement could restrict movement and impose suffering, but it could not completely control memory. Human connection remained equally important. Even limited communication with neighboring prisoners often provided emotional support. Survivors later recalled tapping on walls, whispering brief messages, or simply listening for familiar sounds from nearby cells. These interactions reminded inmates that they remained part of a community despite physical separation. As one considers these experiences, it becomes clear that isolation never became absolute, because human beings continually searched for ways to reach one another even through stone walls and locked doors. The value of companionship increased dramatically when almost every other source of comfort disappeared. Faith, philosophy, and personal convictions helped many prisoners endure. Some found strength through religious practice. Others relied upon ethical principles, family responsibilities, or personal determination. Survivors frequently emphasized that hope did not always appear dramatic or heroic. Often it existed in small forms: belief that another day could be endured, confidence that loved ones deserved remembrance, or simple refusal to surrender mentally. As one reflects on these forms of resilience, it becomes evident that survival often depended upon preserving some internal source of meaning despite overwhelming external hardship. Physical endurance remained a constant challenge. Conditions underground. Weakened prisoners steadily through hunger, thirst, exhaustion, poor ventilation, and restricted movement. Certain inmates survived only because confinement ended before their bodies failed completely. Others demonstrated extraordinary resilience under circumstances that might have overwhelmed many people. As one considers these realities, it becomes clear that survival cannot be explained through willpower alone. Physical condition, chance, timing, and countless other factors influenced outcomes. Yet determination often played a significant role in helping prisoners continue when circumstances seemed unbearable. After liberation, survivors faced the difficult task of explaining experiences that many listeners found difficult to imagine. Describing darkness, isolation, fear, and uncertainty proved challenging because those conditions affected emotions as much as physical senses. Certain survivors worried that audiences would not fully understand what life underground had felt like. Nevertheless, they continued sharing memories because they believed testimony mattered. As one reflects on this commitment, it becomes evident that remembrance became an extension of survival itself. Living through the basement created knowledge that former prisoners felt obligated to preserve. Historians later relied heavily upon these accounts. Official records documented certain punishments and administrative procedures, but survivor testimony revealed human experience behind those records. Through personal accounts, researchers learned how prisoners interpreted events, coped with isolation, communicated through walls, and struggled to maintain hope. As one considers the importance of these contributions, it becomes clear that survivors provided perspectives unavailable through any other source. Their memories transformed historical facts into lived reality. The act of testifying also challenged the purpose of secrecy within Block 11. The underground cells had been hidden, physically and administratively. Information remained restricted, yet every survivor account reduced that secrecy. Every remembered detail illuminated another corner of the basement. As one reflects on this process, it becomes evident that testimony represented a direct response to concealment. Survivors exposed conditions intended to remain hidden, ensuring that future generations could understand what had occurred beneath the camp. Ultimately, the men who survived to tell the story reveal the enduring power of human memory. The underground cells sought to isolate individuals, weaken them physically, and remove them from view. Yet some prisoners endured and carried their experiences beyond Auschwitz. Through testimony, historical investigation, and remembrance, they ensured that the basement of Block 11 would not remain merely a place of silence and disappearance. Instead, it became a documented part of history. Their survival transformed hidden suffering into public knowledge and guaranteed that the voices emerging from beneath the camp would continue to be heard long after the doors of the underground cells were closed forever. Chapter 3. Segment 3. Why the underground cells are still remembered today. As one reaches the final stage of understanding the underground cells hidden beneath Auschwitz, it becomes increasingly clear that these chambers continue to be remembered not simply because they were places of punishment, but because they reveal how far a system of terror was willing to go in order to isolate, control, and destroy human beings away from public view. Many locations within Auschwitz became symbols of suffering. The barracks represented overcrowding and disease. The fences symbolized imprisonment. The crematoria became enduring evidence of mass murder. Yet the underground basement of Block 11 occupies a unique place in historical memory because it exposes a hidden layer of terror operating beneath the camp itself. Visitors who walk through the corridors today often encounter rooms that appear physically small compared to the scale of the camp surrounding them. Yet survivors repeatedly emphasized that the psychological reality of those cells was immense. Inside those chambers, darkness, uncertainty, hunger, isolation, and fear combine to create an environment designed to break prisoners mentally as well as physically. As one reflects on this reality, it becomes evident that the underground cells are remembered because they demonstrate that suffering within Auschwitz extended far beyond what could be seen from the outside. The basement reminds modern generations that some of the most devastating forms of cruelty occur away from public observation. The prisoners sent underground often disappeared from ordinary camp life. Fellow inmates rarely knew exactly what happened after the doors closed behind them. Some emerged, weakened and traumatized. Others never returned. This uncertainty created an atmosphere of fear that spread throughout the camp. The underground cells therefore affected not only those imprisoned inside them but also thousands of prisoners who lived above them. Every disappearance became a warning. Every rumor reinforced the basement's reputation. Every survivor account added another piece to a story that authorities had attempted to keep hidden. As one considers these dynamics, it becomes clear that the basement functioned as both a physical prison and a psychological weapon. It demonstrated the power of secrecy within systems of oppression. Yet the reason these cells remain important today extends beyond historical curiosity. The underground chambers force modern audiences to confront questions about human behavior, authority, and resilience. They reveal what can happen when institutions operate without accountability and when individuals are stripped of rights, identity, and protection. The basement shows how isolation itself can become a form of punishment. It also demonstrates how fear can be used to control populations even when direct violence remains hidden. As one reflects on these lessons, it becomes evident that remembrance serves a practical purpose. History is not preserved merely to describe the past. It is preserved to help future generations recognize warning signs that might otherwise be ignored. The underground cells also remain significant because of the survivors who carried their memories beyond the war. Without their testimony, much of what happened beneath Block 11 would remain unknown. Survivors described the darkness, the silence, the sounds moving through walls, the uncertainty of waiting, and the emotional struggle to preserve hope. These personal accounts transformed physical spaces into human stories. Visitor can see a cell today, but testimony explains what it felt like to exist within that space. As one considers the importance of these accounts, it becomes clear that memory bridges the gap. Survivors refused to allow it to disappear into silence. Memory itself became a form of resistance against forgetting. The underground cells are also remembered because they reveal extraordinary examples of endurance. Conditions were designed to weaken prisoners physically and psychologically, yet many individuals continued finding ways to communicate, remember loved ones, maintain faith, and preserve dignity. Some survived long enough to tell their stories. Others did not survive, but their experiences were preserved through the recollections of fellow prisoners. As one reflects on these acts of endurance, it becomes evident that remembrance honors not only suffering but also resilience. The story of the basement is not solely a story of cruelty. is also a story about people who continued to hold onto humanity under circumstances, specifically designed to destroy it. Today, historians, educators, researchers, and visitors continue studying Block 11 because it provides insight into the broader mechanisms of oppression. Operating within Auschwitz, the basement serves as a reminder that large systems of violence often depend upon smaller hidden spaces where suffering can occur beyond public scrutiny. Understanding those spaces helps explain how terror functioned throughout the camp. Ultimately, the underground cells remain remembered because they represent a convergence of secrecy, fear, suffering, survival, and testimony. They stand as evidence of what occurred beneath the visible surface of Auschwitz and as a warning about the consequences of unchecked power. Through preservation, education, and remembrance, the voices that once echoed through those dark corridors continue speaking to future generations, ensuring that what happened beneath the camp will never disappear entirely from human memory. As one arrives at the conclusion of the story surrounding the underground cells beneath Auschwitz, it becomes increasingly clear that their lasting importance lies not only in what happened there during the war but also in what those chambers continue to teach decades later. The basement of Block 11 was designed to conceal suffering. Thick walls separated prisoners from the outside world. Darkness prevented observation. Secrecy limited information. The people responsible for operating the camp depended upon isolation because isolation reduced visibility and made abuse easier to conceal. Yet despite those efforts, the underground cells did not vanish from history. Instead, they became one of the most studied and remembered locations within Auschwitz. As one reflects on this outcome, it becomes evident that the survival of memory represents a direct contradiction of the basement's original purpose. A place intended to hide suffering ultimately became a place remembered precisely because survivors and historians worked tirelessly to document what happened there. The underground cells remain powerful because they transform abstract historical concepts into concrete human experiences. Discussions of oppression, imprisonment, and terror can sometimes feel distant when expressed only through statistics or administrative records. The basement changes that perspective. It forces attention toward individual experiences. One prisoner listening to footsteps in darkness, another struggling to keep track of time, someone whispering through a wall to an unseen neighbor. Prisoner recalling family members while waiting uncertainly for what might come next. These experiences remind modern audiences that history is ultimately lived by individuals. As one considers these personal dimensions, it becomes clear that remembrance depends upon understanding both large historical events and the human stories contained within them. The underground cells also challenge assumptions about survival. Many people imagine survival primarily as a physical process, yet the basement demonstrates that psychological endurance can be equally important. Prisoners fought to preserve identity, memory, hope, faith, and connection despite conditions designed to eliminate all of them. Some survived because they focused on loved ones. Others survived through prayer, routine, determination, or communication with fellow inmates. As one reflects on these examples, it becomes evident that resilience often emerges in unexpected ways. The story of the basement, therefore, continues inspiring historical interest because it reveals the remarkable capacity of human beings to endure even under extreme pressure. Another reason the underground cells remain remembered involves their role within the broader history of Auschwitz. The camp was not a single uniform environment. It contained many different systems of control, punishment, and terror. The basement of Block 11 illustrates how those systems operated on multiple levels simultaneously. Public punishments created visible fear. Underground punishments created invisible fear. Together they reinforced one another. Understanding the basement therefore helps explain how authority functioned throughout the camp. As one considers this relationship, it becomes clear that the underground cells provide insight into larger mechanisms of oppression extending beyond Auschwitz itself. The lessons contained within these spaces remain relevant because they highlight dangers associated with secrecy, dehumanization, and unchecked power. The preservation of the basement today carries symbolic significance as, well, visitors can walk through corridors where prisoners once waited in uncertainty. They can see cells where people struggled to survive. They can stand inside spaces that were once hidden from public view. Preservation transforms memory into something tangible. Instead of existing only in books or testimony, the physical environment remains available for study and reflection. As one reflects on the importance of preservation, it becomes evident that historical sites serve as powerful educational tools because they create direct connections between present generations and past events. Yet perhaps the most important reason the underground cells are remembered today is because of those who never had the opportunity to tell their own stories. Many prisoners disappeared into the basement and did not return. Their experiences might have been lost completely if survivors had not carried fragments of memory beyond the camp. Every testimony given after liberation helped restore part of a larger story. Every historical investigation recovered another detail. Every preserved record contributed to a more complete understanding of what occurred beneath Block 11. As one considers these efforts, it becomes clear that remembrance serves as a form of recognition for individuals whose lives were interrupted by imprisonment and violence. Ultimately, the underground cells continue to be remembered because they represent both the depths of human cruelty and the persistence of human memory. The basement was intended to isolate people from the world. Instead, the stories connected to it now reach audiences across generations and continents. The darkness that once concealed suffering has been illuminated through testimony, research, preservation, and education. And because survivors chose to speak, historians chose to investigate, and future generations chose to listen, the hidden chambers beneath Auschwitz remain not only a historical location but also a lasting reminder of why remembrance matters. Beneath the brick walls of Auschwitz, hidden below the camp that the world remembers, there existed another world of darkness, a place where prisoners were cut off from light, from time, and sometimes from hope itself. The underground cells of Block 11 were designed to make people disappear into silence, but the stories of those who suffered there refused to stay buried. Through survivor testimony, preserved evidence, and the memories carried across generations, the voices that once echoed through those narrow corridors can still be heard today. They remind us that some of history's darkest crimes happened not only in places everyone could see, but also in hidden spaces where suffering was meant to remain invisible forever. Remembering these stories is more than studying the past. It is ensuring that those who endured these horrors are never forgotten. If you found this story powerful and want to help preserve the forgotten histories of the past, make sure to subscribe and join us for more untold stories from history's darkest chapters.